Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. I'm Robert, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they are essential to help the channel grow and allow me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let us dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The air in Pimlico during August was thick and oppressive, clinging to the elegant white stucco terraces of Alderney Street like a damp blanket. It was Monday, August 23rd, 2010, and inside the top-floor flat of number 36, an unbearable heat had been building for days. Residents of the Grand Mansion block, located just a short walk from the River Thames, had noticed a faint, sickly sweet smell in the communal hallway. But at the height of a London summer, strange odors weren't uncommon. They chalked it up to plumbing issues, a forgotten rubbish bag, or the ordinary quirks of city living. But for Gareth Williams' colleagues, the man who lived in that top-floor apartment, a different kind of worry had been mounting. Williams, a reserved and intensely private 31-year-old, was known for his meticulous work ethic. He was a code breaker, a mathematician of extraordinary ability on a 3-year assignment to MI6QICHQ. He wasn't someone who'd disappear without explanation, yet he'd missed meetings and wasn't responding to calls. For an entire week, an eerie silence had replaced his usually reliable presence. Finally, concern reached a critical point. A welfare check was authorized. That afternoon, 2 police constables arrived at Alderney Street, their footsteps echoing in the hushed, carpeted stairwell as they climbed to the top floor. They knocked on the door, their raps ringing sharply in the stillness. There was no answer. After consulting with building management, the decision was made to force entry. The lock on the pristine white door gave with a snap. The first sensation that hit the officers was the heat. It was physical. A wave of stale, suffocating warmth that seemed to steal their breath. The flat's central heating was running, inexplicably set high despite the summer weather outside. Then came the smell, now overwhelming. A cloying sweetness of decay that caught in their throats. The interior was immaculate, almost sterile. The living area was tidy, the kitchen clean. A woman's wig from a collection of expensive female clothing and shoes worth thousands of pounds lay across a chair, an unusual feature in an otherwise minimalist dwelling. The officers moved forward carefully and methodically, their senses heightened. They checked the main bedroom. It was empty. Then they proceeded to the en-suite bathroom, and there they found it. In the gleaming white bathtub sat a large red North Face hold-all, a vivid, jarring splash of color against the bathroom's neutral palette. The bag was fully zipped shut, with a brass padlock securing both zippers together, an object that seemed strangely out of place, luggage positioned in an unlikely location. One officer, a seasoned veteran of Scotland Yard, felt a cold coil of dread tighten inside him. His experience had taught him that appearances can deceive. A forensics team was called. The flat became an official crime scene. London's bustling outside world faded away as focus narrowed on number 36 Alderney Street, where a mystery began unraveling, one destined to entangle international intelligence operations. This puzzle would test Britain's premier law enforcement and spy agencies, while leaving family in Wales grief-stricken and seeking answers. What happened next was meticulously documented. Forensic experts began careful evidence collection, recording every detail, every print, every thread. The hold-all was central among them all. A typical sports duffel roughly 1 meter long, secured by common brass hardware. The unzipping produced sounds abnormally loud in the tense silence filling the small space. Opening it revealed the source of the smell and the heat's grim function. Curled in a fetal position, naked and decomposing, was the body of a male later identified as Gareth Williams. There were no apparent injuries or signs of struggle, but the body's placement, locked inside the bag with the padlock keys, resting beneath his remains within the container itself, indicated nothing natural about this death scene. The silent, sterile environment only deepened the mystery. News broke, sending tremors through the UK establishment. The victim wasn't an ordinary citizen, but an MI6 operative safeguarding state secrets, discovered under bizarre and disturbing conditions. Media swarmed Pimlico, cameras and microphones forming a stark contrast to the covert world Gareth once inhabited. The immediate questions were unsettling. Was this an accident? An autoerotic mishap gone wrong? Or something darker? Murder? If so, why leave a spy in such a macabre display? Thus began the inquiry into the spy in the bag death, plunging investigators into a maze filled with secrecy, falsehoods, and unresolved riddles surrounding a man whose life already embodied contradictions long before becoming a murder case focal point. Tears. He'd been born in Holyhead on the Welsh island of Anglesey, an area known for its rugged coastline and tight-knit communities, a stark contrast to the affluent streets of Pimlico and the secretive corridors of Vauxhall Cross. A child prodigy, a mathematical genius, he reportedly started university at Bangor when he was just 17, earning top honors in mathematics. His brilliant mind was his ticket away from a quiet island life. He was recruited by GCHQ, the UK's signals intelligence agency based in Cheltenham, where his exceptional ability to decode patterns and ciphers could be put to use serving national security. By all accounts, he excelled. A quiet, modest man with a powerful intellect. But he was also described as intensely private, someone who rigidly separated his work from his personal life. His family knew he did important work for the government, but they, along with almost everyone else, remained in the dark about specifics. In 2009, he was temporarily seconded to MI6 in London, a transfer that placed him at the heart of Britain's foreign intelligence network. He was training to become an operational officer, a role that would have shifted him from the academic world of code breaking into the riskier and more volatile realm of human intelligence. He handled sensitive assignments, liaising with American agencies like the NSA and the FBI. The classified information he possessed was of the highest sensitivity. His life in London was entirely his own creation. He lived alone in a security-cleared flat in Pimlico. He was an avid cyclist, known for his excellent physical fitness. But there was another side to his life, one that only emerged after his death. Investigators found a wardrobe stocked with designer women's clothing worth £20,000, sterling luxury dresses and shoes, all in pristine condition. He'd also browsed websites related to bondage and sadomasochism, though police assessment indicated these visits were occasional, not obsessive. His former landlady from his Cheltenham days told police a strange story. 3 years before his death, she and her husband had found him in his flat calling for help. He was tied to his bedposts and claimed he was practicing escapology, trying to develop the skill to free himself. They released him, convinced the incident had sexual undertones. Could this be the key to his death? A hidden life involving cross-dressing and bondage that had somehow ended in tragedy. The Metropolitan Police's Counter-Terrorism Command, SO-15, was assigned to investigate, a clear sign of how seriously officials took the matter. They had to navigate a complex web of national security concerns. MI6, famously secretive, guarded its methods and personnel zealously. A public interest immunity certificate was signed by Foreign Secretary William Hague, effectively concealing details of Williams's work and his collaborations with American agencies. The early phase of the investigation was fraught with challenges. The body's decomposition, accelerated by the heat in the flat, made determining the exact cause of death impossible. The pathologist found no wounds, and toxicology screens revealed no traces of alcohol or common drugs. The official cause of death remained undetermined. Attention, therefore, turned to the bag. How did he get inside it, and how was it locked with a padlock? This question became the central mystery of the investigation. Police consulted two escapology experts. They tried repeatedly but unsuccessfully to lock themselves inside an identical bag in the same position. They concluded it was impossible for Williams to have done this alone. No fingerprints from Williams were found on the padlock, zipper, or even on the bathtub's rim, suggesting he hadn't touched them. If he couldn't have locked himself in, then someone else must have. The investigation shifted from a possible accident to a probable homicide. But who and why? Law enforcement faced what seemed an almost perfect crime. There were no signs of forced entry to the flat. Trace DNA from at least 2 other people was found on the bag, but no definitive forensic link to a suspect could be established. The media, lacking hard facts, filled the void with speculation. Theories involving spy games gained traction. Had Williams uncovered a dangerous secret? Was he targeted by a foreign power? His death had all the hallmarks of an espionage thriller, and journalists ran with it enthusiastically. Meanwhile, police followed more mundane leads. They issued an e-fit of a couple with Mediterranean features seen entering his building's communal entrance months before his death. But this clue, like so many others, led nowhere. As the investigation dragged on without resolution, frustration mounted, especially for Gareth's family. They felt MI6 hadn't been fully cooperative. The agency had waited an entire week before reporting him missing, a delay that critically compromised forensic evidence preservation. This fueled suspicions among relatives that something was being hidden, a sentiment that would only strengthen as time passed without answers. In April 2012, nearly 2 years after the discovery of his body, the formal inquest into Gareth Williams's death began at Westminster Coroner's Court. This was a moment of public accountability, a chance for the established facts to be openly presented. Dr. Fiona Wilcox, a coroner known for her sharp intellect and direct manner, presided over the proceedings. Over 8 days, testimony came from various witnesses, police officers, forensic experts, family members, and unusually, intelligence officers who testified from behind screens to protect their identities. The story that emerged revealed systemic failures and persistent mysteries. Evidence showed MI6's week-long delay in reporting his absence. Williams's line manager had assumed he was on leave. His sister Sherry had tried to reach him, her calls and messages going unanswered as her worry grew day by day. The coroner delivered harsh criticism of the intelligence agency, calling their inaction a failure of communication that compounded the family's anguish and hindered the police investigation. The police investigation also came under scrutiny. It was revealed that 9 memory sticks belonging to Williams, found in his MI6 office, weren't handed over to the lead investigator until after the inquest had begun. Dr. Wilcox didn't mince words, calling it an appalling oversight and stating that multiple agencies had failed. The critical question of the bag was examined with painstaking forensic detail. The escapologists who'd tried but couldn't replicate the feat presented their findings. The court heard that even if Williams had contorted himself into the bag, securing the zipper and external padlock without leaving any DNA or fingerprint evidence was highly improbable. Dr. Wilcox weighed all the testimony, including speculation about his private life and covert work. In her final ruling, she was unequivocal. She rejected the idea that his death resulted from an accident tied to autoerotic activity. She noted his sporadic visits to bondage sites didn't suggest a sustained interest. Speculation about his cross-dressing, she suggested, might have been a deliberate attempt by unknown parties to mislead the media and obscure the real cause of death. Her conclusion was stark and damning. She told the hushed courtroom that she was satisfied, on the balance of probabilities, that Gareth Williams had been unlawfully killed. His death was unnatural and likely criminally facilitated. She asserted it was probable that another person or persons had placed him in the bag and locked it. She went further, indicating that Secret Service involvement in his death remained a legitimate line of inquiry. For Williams' family, the ruling was a validation. They'd long believed he was murdered. In a statement, they said the coroner's findings accurately represented what happened to him. The puzzle seemed not to be whether he was killed, but by whom and why. Dr. Wilcox offered a sobering final thought. Because of lost evidence and the secrecy surrounding the case, she doubted the exact circumstances of his death would ever be fully explained. The coroner's verdict should have been the end, the official recognition of a terrible crime. But in the strange and shadowy world of Gareth Williams's case, nothing was straightforward. After the inquest, the Metropolitan Police launched a review of their investigation. For another year, they re-examined evidence and pursued new leads, claiming they received unprecedented cooperation from serving MI6 officers. In November 2013, the Met announced their findings, and they were stunning. Directly contradicting the coroner's verdict, Deputy Assistant Commissioner Martin Hewitt stated that Gareth Williams most likely died alone after accidentally locking himself in the bag. The police theory argued that it was theoretically possible for Williams to have gotten in and locked it himself. They acknowledged gaps in their knowledge about both accident and murder theories, but concluded that without firm evidence of another person's presence, accidental death seemed more likely. DNA traces on the bag were deemed inconclusive. No signs of forced entry were interpreted as further support for him being alone. The original lead detective, Hamish Campbell, even told a news outlet he believed Williams's private life, not his work, was connected to his death. This reversal provoked widespread disbelief and anger. For his family, it was a devastating blow. Their lawyer accused police of dodging the most obvious explanation. Observers saw it as an establishment attempt to close a chapter deeply embarrassing to both law enforcement and intelligence agencies. The notion of a cover-up, once considered fringe, now seemed plausible to many. How could the police's conclusion differ so dramatically from that of a coroner who'd reviewed the same evidence? The investigation stalled, and the official story became hopelessly divided. A coroner declaring murder and police insisting accident. For the public, the mystery of the spy found in a bag grew deeper and more disturbing. Though never formally closed, the case gradually faded from public view, joining London's list of unsolved mysteries. In 2021 and again in 2024, Scotland Yard announced they were conducting forensic re-examinations of the case, hoping new DNA techniques on evidence collected over a decade earlier might yield fresh leads. Hopes were raised that answers might finally be possible, but both reviews concluded without success. No new DNA evidence emerged to suggest anyone else had been in the flat. The forensic advances that had held such promise ultimately only deepened the silence. The apartment at 36 Alderney Street has long since been sold to new occupants. Time has moved on, but Gareth Williams's memory persists. He endures as a figure shrouded in mystery, his life marked by secrecy, and his death by a puzzle that seems designed to remain unsolvable. Was he a victim of his own dangerous personal pursuits? A man who died in a bizarre accident that defied logic and expert analysis? Or was he a pawn in a high-stakes world of espionage? A man who knew too much, eliminated by a ruthless and invisible enemy, his murder then concealed by an officially sanctioned deception. The two competing narratives, the coroner's ruling of unlawful death and the police's finding of tragic accident, remain suspended, irreconcilable, and deeply unsettling. One tells of a crime that was never solved, the other of a tragedy that was never fully explained. Both deny Gareth Williams' family the one thing they've sought from the beginning: truth. In a quiet cemetery in Valley, Anglesey, beneath the wide Welsh sky, rests Gareth Williams's headstone. The child prodigy with numbers, the adult guardian of classified knowledge, is now at peace. But the questions about his final solitary moments in a London flat persist, a haunting and sorrowful reminder of a mystery that both intelligence and law enforcement circles have failed, or perhaps refused, to solve. The spy in the bag remains an enigma, a story without closure, a life reduced to an unanswered question. Story 2. In the quiet town of Tamworth, Staffordshire, where narrow lanes wound past rows of modest brick homes and the air carried the soft hum of everyday life, Keely Bunker was known as the young woman who lit up every room she entered. At just 20 years old, she had a laugh that rang out like wind chimes on a summer day, and eyes that sparkled with hope for tomorrow. Keely dreamed of becoming a teaching assistant, guiding young children through life with the same warmth she showed everyone she met. She was the heart of her family, the beloved daughter of Debbie Watkins, a devoted sister, and a cherished niece to relatives who saw her as pure sunshine. Her life, though ordinary in its rhythms, was rich with simple joys, nights out with friends, family gatherings, and the excitement of future possibilities. No one could have imagined that on the night of September 18th, 2019, as Keely headed out to celebrate her recent birthday, her path would cross with evil hiding in plain sight. The evening began like so many others, filled with excitement and the carefree energy of youth. Keely, dressed in her favorite outfit, a casual top and fitted leggings, met up with her good friend Monique for a concert in Birmingham. City lights shimmered as they arrived at Snob's nightclub, a popular spot pulsing with music and laughter. In the crowd was Wesley Street, a 20-year-old local from Tamworth who had known Keely since childhood. They'd grown up in the same circles, sharing playground memories and occasional hellos through the years. To Keely, Wesley was just a familiar face, an old acquaintance who seemed harmless. She trusted him as anyone would trust someone who'd been around since childhood. That trust would become her undoing. As the concert wound down, the group decided to head back to Tamworth, a journey involving a train ride and a short walk home. Around 4 a.m., they reached the early morning stillness of their town. The streets were empty, with only the distant rumble of a car and the muted footsteps of friends saying goodbye. Monique had planned to walk Keely home, but as the group thinned out, Wesley stepped in. "I'll walk her," he offered casually, his tone as light as someone doing a small favor. Keely, tired from the night's festivities but content, agreed. The walk was only about 20 minutes, a familiar route through peaceful residential streets to her front door. What harm could come from such a short walk with a longtime friend? As they set off, the cool September breeze brushed their skin, carrying the faint scent of damp earth from nearby parks. Keely chatted lightly, perhaps recounting highlights from the concert or sharing laughs about the night's adventures. Wesley walked beside her, his manner seemingly ordinary. But beneath his calm exterior, something far darker was brewing, an obsession that had festered longer than anyone knew. Security footage would later capture their silhouettes moving together, Keely's stride occasionally uncertain, as if she sensed something shifting in the air. They passed the phone box near Wesley's home, a spot where he later claimed they'd parted ways. But surveillance footage told a different story. They continued toward Wigginton Park, a green space on the edge of town, lined with trees and a winding stream, now shrouded in darkness, moonlight casting long shadows across grass and water. Wesley suggested taking a different path, perhaps under the pretense of having a quick smoke or stopping briefly to rest, and trusting, unsuspecting Keely followed. In those isolated woods, where evening turned to horror, Wesley's intentions unraveled violently. He attacked her viciously, forcing himself upon her, and shattering the fragile peace of dawn. Keely fought back fiercely with all her strength, her scratches marking his face and neck, evidence that would later be used against him. Her screams echoed among the trees, but the emptiness swallowed them. The fierce struggle left defensive wounds scarring her neck and arms, proof of her desperate fight for life. It ended with hands around her throat, applying pressure that lasted not seconds, but agonizing minutes. Her struggles weakening as oxygen left her body, her eyes wide with fear and betrayal. Gasping for breath that wouldn't come, her mind racing toward family and dreams and a life barely begun, until her body went limp on the cold earth. After the assault, driven by panic or cold calculation, he dragged her body toward the creek, submerging it partially in shallow water. He pulled down her leggings and underwear around her ankles, a final indignity following the brutality he'd inflicted. Afterward, he covered her with twigs and leaves, a crude attempt to hide his crime. Satisfied for the moment, he went home, climbed into bed, and fell asleep, as if closing his eyes could erase what he'd done. Dawn brought panic. Keely hadn't come home. Her mother, Debbie, paced through the house, her heart heavy with dread. Friends and family sprang into action immediately. Monique, consumed with guilt for not walking her home, joined the search. Flyers went up all over Tamworth. Social media buzzed with pleas for information, and police were called. Wesley, pretending to share their concern, even participated in the initial search, directing volunteers to the phone box where he claimed they'd separate. But as the day wore on, the search intensified, with volunteers combing parks and paths Keely might have taken. Among them was Keely's uncle, Jason Brown, a man whose love for his niece drove him to search every corner of the landscape. As dusk fell on September 19th, Jason made his way into Wigginton Park, his eyes scanning the bushes near the creek. Light was fading, casting eerie shadows, but something caught his attention. A flash of red among the foliage. He pushed through the plants and gasped as he saw hair and an arm wearing a recognizable bracelet. It was Keely. A terrible scream tore from him, echoing through the park like a raw cry of grief. "I found her," he shouted, dropping to his knees beside the stream. Nearby, an off-duty police officer, Dean Reynolds, heard the cry and rushed to the scene. He confirmed the tragic news. There were no signs of life. The scene was devastating. Keely's body lay face down in the water, partially hidden but not enough to avoid discovery. Police cordoned off the area. Devers searched the waterway, and the investigation shifted from missing person to murder. News spread quickly through Tamworth. The town was in shock. Memorials sprang up quickly, flowers piled at the park's entrance, and questions swirled about what had happened to this vibrant young woman. An autopsy revealed the brutal truth. Keely had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death, her body showing signs of a fierce struggle. DNA evidence from the scene clearly implicated Wesley Street. He was arrested just an hour after her discovery, his initial story falling apart under questioning. "We split up at the phone box," he claimed at first, but surveillance footage contradicted this. They'd entered the park together. As investigators pressed him, his stories shifted inconsistently, first denying any involvement, then admitting his presence but claiming it was an accident. 4 different versions emerged before trial, each more desperate than the last. Other women came forward too, their accounts revealing a frightening pattern. Wesley was charged not only with Keely's murder, but also with 2 additional rapes and 3 sexual assaults on young women he knew, friends or acquaintances who had trusted him as Keely had. One survivor said she drew strength from Keely's case to report her own assault. These accusations spanned several years, exposing Wesley not as a one-time offender, but as a predator who exploited trust. He'd once pursued a football career, even securing positions with local teams like Lickfield and Tamworth, but that path had diverted into warehouse work and now infamy. He had no permanent address when arrested, a drifting threat hidden in plain sight. The trial at Stafford Crown Court began in July 2020, a somber proceeding under COVID restrictions. Yet witness testimonies were piercingly powerful. Prosecutor Jacob Hallam QC presented the case methodically, detailing how Keeley had trusted Wesley during that fateful walk home. Surveillance videos were shown to jurors, Keeley dancing happily at the club, unaware of eyes fixed too intently on her. Wesley's expression in footage suggesting obsession, a predator sizing up his target. Footage from the rugby grounds, never released publicly, captured their final moments together. Keeley trying to pull away, Wesley relentless. Forensic evidence was conclusive. His DNA inside her body, scratches matching her fingernails, GPS data from his phone, placing him at the crime scene, not just once but 5 times after the murder. He claimed he'd return to cover her remains respectfully, though the branches he used were sparse. Wesley testified himself, speaking steadily yet avoiding eye contact, admitting his initial lies came from fear and shame. "We were flirting," he claimed, portraying mutual interest, kisses, and playful banter on the way home. In the park, he said things progressed consensually. During the encounter, he claimed he placed an arm around her neck, jokingly. Yet she collapsed after 10 to 30 seconds. He said he'd attempted resuscitation with chest rubs and scalp massages, but it was unsuccessful. In a panic, he said, he hid her body, went home and slept, then later returned to add branches out of respect. The jury heard the prosecution systematically dismantle his story. A chokehold lasting minutes, not seconds. Her scratches indicated struggle, not play. He hadn't panicked. He'd slept, then returned to survey his work. Heartfelt testimonies filled the courtroom. Debbie's voice faltered as she recounted losing her cherished, lovely daughter. Keeley's sibling described her as one of the most vibrant, compassionate, and beautiful people the world had ever known. Friends recalled her kindness and dreams that were tragically cut short. Judge Paul Farrar saw through the lies. "You went on to sexually assault Keeley Bunker, during which you killed her by strangling her," he stated during sentencing. Wesley's history of forced encounters sealed his fate. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty on every charge. On August 7, 2020, Wesley Street received a life sentence with a minimum of 29 years and 46 days before parole consideration. The judge emphasized the profound loss, not only Keeley's unfulfilled dream to become a teacher, but also the void in her family's lives. "You may spend the rest of your life in prison," he warned, noting a lifetime supervision order if ever released. Detective Inspector Cheryl Hannon called him a cunning and deceitful individual who exploited trust. The community breathed easier, yet the wounds remain. Since then, Tamworth has honored Keeley with memorials and awareness campaigns. Her story serves as a sobering reminder of hidden dangers. Her family holds tight to memories, vowing to preserve her legacy. Wesley remains imprisoned, his lies exposed, while Keeley's spirit lives on, a symbol of resilience in the face of tragedy. Story 3. The January sun. A pale disk in the winter sky cast long, skeletal shadows across the fields of County Offaly. It was an ordinary Wednesday, crisp and cold, the kind of day that calls for a brisk walk to invigorate the spirit and clear the mind. For Aisling Murphy, a 23-year-old primary school teacher with a soul rich in music and a future brimming with promise, it was the perfect day for such an outing. Aisling was a vibrant thread woven into the fabric of her community. A talented traditional musician, she could coax melodies from a fiddle and draw emotion from a concertina, her hands moving effortlessly across instruments with natural grace. Her classroom at Scoil Naom Comseal in Durrow radiated warmth and joy, where children's minds were nurtured with the same passion she applied to her music. She was beloved as a daughter, sister, friend, fiancée, a young woman on the cusp of a life she was eagerly planning with her partner, Ryan Casey. On January 12, 2022, school ended at 2:30 p.m. Surveillance footage, an observant, silent recorder, showed Aisling at 2:37 p.m. heading to her car, a red Seat Cortivo. She wore a dark blue jacket, dark blue leggings, and a Kilcormac Killowy Gay Club shirt showing support for her hometown athletic team. A pink knitted hat with a brown pom-pom topped her head, providing a cheerful contrast to the subdued winter landscape. A delicate gold chain with her name hung around her neck, a refined statement of identity. She drove to the Dangan Road car park in Tullamore, a well-known spot near the Grand Canal. The canal, a peaceful waterway cutting through Ireland's Midlands, was a favorite path for walkers, runners, and cyclists. At 2:51 p.m., she left her car and began walking east on the towpath toward Digby Bridge. Her Fitbit Versa 3 smartwatch, a gift from Ryan, faithfully tracked her journey, its tiny sensors logging each stride, her pulse rate, the rhythm of her life in motion. Location data showed she maintained a brisk, steady pace of approximately 5 kilometers per hour, a young woman at her prime, enjoying the simple pleasure of an afternoon walk. The final surveillance image capturing her alive was taken at 2:55 p.m. She reached Digby Bridge by 3:16 p.m., crossed it, and began her way back, heading west toward the parking lot. The sun was starting its slow descent, the light mellowing, the air growing colder. The towpath grew quiet, its typical midweek activity diminished. For 5 more minutes, she kept up her pace uninterrupted. At 3:21 p.m., however, all forward movement stopped abruptly according to data from her Fitbit. What had been tracking regular rhythmic beats suddenly turned turbulent, chaotic, marks betraying signs of violent, frantic resistance. In that instant, the peace along the canal shattered completely. A predator materialized from obscurity. Joseph Puska, age 33, originally from Slovakia, someone completely unfamiliar, never encountered previously. He overpowered Aisling, pulling her away from the main path, down into a deep ditch of dense, thorny undergrowth serving as both hideaway and scene of horror. There, amid the cold, damp ground, he unleashed a savage, brutal assault, plunging a serrated blade into her neck 11 times. Her Fitbit registered her heart rate dropping sharply, life fading second by second. By 3:30 p.m., readings weakened further. At exactly 3:31 p.m., her pulse stopped entirely. Thus, the melody defining Aisling Murphy's being fell silent. As dusk enveloped Tullamore, apprehension mounted steadily. Aisling hadn't come home. Attempts to contact her via phone yielded no response. An alert sounded, a search initiated. Finding her remains in the ditch provoked a wave of terror and incredulity throughout the locality, quickly spreading across the country. The killing of Aisling Murphy, a young woman slain during daylight while exercising, became an emblem of broader, widespread fear, the vulnerability of women in a world where violence can surface unpredictably anywhere. Memorial gatherings took place throughout Ireland and the United Kingdom. Crowds gathered silently in her honor, candles glowing against the night, a shared manifestation of sorrow, outrage, and a call for reform. Gardaí launched an extensive investigation, resolved to identify the perpetrator behind this heinous, violent deed. The crime scene was scrutinized thoroughly. Initially, the inquiry centered on 2 separate arrests, but both were soon released without charges. The urgency to apprehend the culprit was intense. A key development emerged surprisingly. 2 days after the homicide, Joseph Puska arrived at St. James's Hospital, Dublin, suffering abdominal stab injuries. He alleged an assault occurred in Blanchardstown, but his account rapidly fell apart. During Gardaí interrogation, his falsehoods disintegrated. He admitted killing Aisling Murphy, stating he'd followed her along the canal and slashed her throat. He was unable to explain his motive. His admission, conveyed via an interpreter, was a stark, emotionless recounting of an act of extreme savagery. He was arrested and charged with her murder. The trial against Józef Puska began on October 16, 2023, at the Central Criminal Court in Dublin. For 3 weeks, a jury of 9 men and 3 women heard the distressing account of Aisling Murphy's final moments. Puska, dressed in a gray suit, remained expressionless following proceedings through an interpreter. He entered a plea of not guilty. His legal team sought to have his confession and surveillance footage excluded, arguing he'd been in no medical condition to speak with Gardai while hospitalized, and that video recording violated his privacy. Presiding Judge, Mr. Justice Tony Hunt, rejected these motions, ruling the evidence was admissible. He affirmed that Gardai weren't required to obtain medical clearance before questioning a suspect, and that CCTV material didn't breach Puska's privacy. The prosecution, led by Anne-Marie Lawler-Esqui, carefully built their case. They presented surveillance evidence tracking Puska's movements the day of the murder, placing him at the crime scene. They provided DNA evidence linking him to Aisling, and they presented his own words, the confession he'd given at St. James's Hospital. The defense offered an implausible new story. Puska testified, claiming he'd been attacked by another masked man who'd also murdered Aisling. He said he'd been trying to help her when he was stabbed. It was a desperate, unconvincing tale the jury saw through with damning clarity. On November 9, 2023, after just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered a unanimous guilty verdict. A wave of applause and relief rippled through the court. Mr. Justice Tony Hunt, in a rare display of judicial emotion, expressed his satisfaction that the jury hadn't spent more time considering the absurdity Puska had presented in his defense. Looking directly at the convicted killer, he declared, "We have evil in this room. Undeniably so." Aisling's mother, Kathleen, held up a picture of her beautiful, smiling daughter, a heartbreaking symbol of the life so viciously taken. The sentencing occurred on November 17, 2023. Józef Puska received the mandatory life sentence for murder. Judge Hunt, however, voiced his frustration with Irish sentencing law's limitations, noting that if he could have issued a whole life term, it would have been thoroughly deserved. The sentencing hearing also provided an opportunity for Aisling's family to express their profound grief. Their victim impact statements, read aloud in a hushed courtroom, were a raw and powerful tribute to their love for Aisling and their lasting sorrow. Her mother, Kathleen, in a statement delivered by a female Garda sergeant, spoke of the persistent nagging fear inherent in every parent's life. As a parent, you want your child to go out into the world and live a full and meaningful life, while being acutely aware that parental love alone can't protect them. She said, "I couldn't protect my precious Aisling, and now she's gone forever." She called Puska an evil monster who should never experience freedom again. Her sister Amy spoke of their special bond through music. "Music is not and will never be the same without Aisling," she said. "Our passion for Irish music was linked with an extraordinary connection. We could read each other's minds when we played together." She painted the heartbreaking image of Aisling's pink fiddle case now gathering dust, a stark reminder that they'll never perform together again. Speaking directly to Puska, she declared, "You took her life. You silenced her voice, and you robbed us of our family of 5. And then there was Ryan Casey, the man who'd loved Aisling since they were 15. The man she was meant to marry, to build a home with, to start a family with." His voice, heavy with grief and fury, resonated through the courtroom. "Because of you," he said, his words aimed at the stoic figure in the defendant's box, "I lost my Aisling. I have lost everything I ever wanted in life. I'll never get to marry my soulmate or see her smile again." He characterized Puska's behavior during the trial, the smirks, the grins, the complete absence of remorse, as emblematic of pure evil. "You will never, ever hurt another woman again," he vowed. The case didn't end with Puska's conviction. In subsequent months, his relatives faced legal consequences for their efforts to conceal his crime. His wife, Lucia Istakova, admitted guilt for withholding information. His brothers, Marek and Lubomir Jr., were found guilty of identical charges. Their wives, Josefina Granova and Viera Gasiova, were convicted for burning his clothes in an attempt to destroy evidence. The court learned how family had closed ranks to protect what they termed their husband-brother, an animal. They all received custodial sentences, a clear signal that those who aid and enable criminals will also face consequences. Following the trial, a legal dispute arose between Ryan Casey and the BBC. In his victim impact statement, Ryan voiced his fury and disillusionment with a system he felt had let Aisling down. He expressed his sense that Ireland wasn't the safe nation he remembered from his youth. A reporter on a BBC Northern Ireland program criticized his remarks, calling them encouragement of hatred and implying he was being celebrated as a figurehead by extremist groups. Ryan initiated a defamation lawsuit. In July 2025, the BBC settled the case outside court, compensating him significantly and publicly affirming they didn't view him as prejudiced or as someone provoking hatred. This outcome represented a victory for Ryan, affirming his right to express his grief and anger without facing slander. The killing of Aisling Murphy left a permanent wound on Ireland's collective spirit. It was a crime that echoed far beyond the peaceful towpath where she drew her last breath. It sparked a nationwide conversation about violence against women, about women's safety, and about the need for a society that truly values and protects every individual. In their darkest hour, Aisling's family have emerged as powerful advocates for change. Their dignity and strength serve as an inspiration to countless others. Aisling's legacy isn't one of darkness and despair. Rather, it's defined by grace, kindness, empathy, talent, love, and purity. It's the memory of a young woman who embraced life with joy and passion, who brought light and music to the world. Her story serves as a poignant reminder of life's fragile nature, but it also stands as proof of love's enduring power, the human spirit's ability to persevere, and the unwavering call for justice. Though Aisling Murphy's music was silenced on that cold January day, her memory and the echoes of her life will continue to resonate for years to come. Story 4. The light in Madrid is special. It's a brilliant, clear radiance that seems to polish the old golden buildings and cast long, dramatic shadows across the bustling plazas. For Ana Maria Nezevich, a 40-year-old Colombian-American woman from South Florida, that light represented the hope of a fresh beginning. In December 2023, she'd traveled across the ocean, leaving behind the humid, familiar landscape of her life in Fort Lauderdale for the vibrant, historic streets of Spain's capital. This wasn't a vacation. It was an escape. Her 13-year marriage to David Nezevich, a handsome and successful consultant, had fractured and finally shattered. The divorce wasn't amicable. It was, as her sister described it, an ugly divorce, a bitter battle over the substantial wealth they'd built together. Anna, who'd been an equal partner in their success, was now fighting for her fair share, a 50-50 split of their assets. But the fight had exhausted her. The arguments had grown fiercer, the tension more palpable. Anna had confided to loved ones that she feared David. So she'd fled, finding refuge in the anonymity of a foreign city, a place where she could breathe freely again, where she could begin imagining a different future. She rented a sleek little apartment in Salamanca, one of Madrid's most exclusive neighborhoods. Her days were filled with simple, restorative pleasures of a life reclaimed. She visited the city's galleries, wandered aimlessly through the twisting streets of the old quarter, and savored the unhurried rhythm of Spanish life. She was making friends and building a new social circle. She even nurtured a fresh dream to create a charitable foundation focused on helping women who'd suffered abuse, a mission that now resonated with painful personal clarity. For a few precious weeks, it seemed she'd escaped the shadows of her past. The Madrid light was working its magic. She was healing. But those shadows reached far, and they were stretching toward her from across the ocean. David Nesovich was a man who prided himself on his intelligence and his ability to solve complex problems. His business, which focused on providing computer support to companies in South Florida, demonstrated his sharp analytical mind. But as the divorce proceedings dragged on, another kind of problem consumed his attention. The problem of Anna dying. The problem of the money. He didn't want to split their assets 50-50. He wanted more. And Anna, once his partner, had become an obstacle, an adversary standing in the way of what he believed was rightfully his. In the fall of 2023, while Anna was still in Florida, but dreaming of her escape, David's methodical mind began devising a solution, a plan of breathtaking audacity and cold calculation, a plot that would cross borders and recruit a cast of unwitting accomplices. His first move involved contacting a woman in Colombia online with an unusual request. He needed help translating certain messages into flawless Colombian Spanish, messages about a new romantic interest she'd met, and a trip to a remote country house near Madrid with poor cell reception. Finding it odd but harmless, she helped him compose these texts, not realizing she was drafting the script for someone's disappearance. By late January 2024, the plan shifted from cyberspace to reality. David Nesovich, the thriving Florida businessman, flew from Miami to Istanbul. From there, he traveled to Belgrade, Serbia's capital, where he had connections waiting. Upon arrival at Belgrade Airport, he rented himself a Peugeot 308. A car not meant for corporate travel, but specifically assigned toward one objective: driving over 17 hours through Europe to reach Madrid by February 2nd, which fell on a Friday during crisp, cool weather conditions. That afternoon marked the last confirmed sighting of a vibrant, hopeful woman entering her apartment building in the exclusive Salamanca district. Before dusk descended, the final phase of his meticulously planned execution began. A figure in a motorcycle helmet obscuring all facial features, moving with purpose, disabling surveillance equipment with black spray paint, rendering the lobby devoid of visual monitoring. He cleverly applied adhesive tape to prevent the door lock mechanism from engaging properly, enabling repeated access whenever needed. An hour-long silence followed, broken only by oblivious urban life continuing outside, unaware of the tragedy unfolding behind closed doors. Shortly after 10:30 p.m., the helmeted figure returned to the building's parking area, now carrying a suitcase. He stepped out into the Madrid evening and vanished. The next day, Anna's loved ones received a string of strange texts from her phone. Written in perfect Colombian Spanish, the dialect David Nesovich had deliberately acquired, the messages described a sudden whirlwind romance. One message read, "I met someone wonderful. He has a country house about 2 hours from Madrid. We're going there now and I'll be staying a few days." The reception is really bad, though. To her friends, who knew Anna's typically cautious and measured nature, the messages were immediately concerning. They didn't sound like her. The idea of her impulsively running off with a new acquaintance was completely out of character. Attempts to reach her failed. Her phone was turned off. A growing sense of dread began to set in. Sana Ramo, Anna's closest friend, was among those who received the bizarre texts and sensed something was wrong. She contacted the police. When Spanish authorities entered Anna's apartment, they found a scene that appeared normal yet deeply disturbing. There were no signs of struggle or violence, but Anna was gone, along with her phone, laptop, and passport. It was as if she'd simply evaporated. The investigation began as an urgent international effort to locate the missing American woman. The strange texts stood out as an immediate red flag. The story of a spontaneous romance seemed too neat, too perfectly crafted to explain a sudden vanishing. Agents from the Spanish National Police and the FBI dug deeper. Reviewing security footage from her apartment building, they witnessed the helmeted man, the spray paint, and the suitcase. They watched an abduction unfold. The hunt for this man led investigators along a trail of digital and physical evidence, all pointing to one person, David Knežević. They traced the purchase of spray paint and duct tape to a Madrid hardware store. Surveillance at the shop showed a man bearing a strong resemblance to David making a cash purchase. They examined his travel records, discovering his journey from Miami through Istanbul to Belgrade, and uncovering the Peugeot he'd rented. When David returned the vehicle to the rental agency in Belgrade, it showed alterations. Windows were tinted, identifying decals were removed, and there were signs that license plates had been swapped. The odometer registered nearly 4,800 additional miles, roughly the distance for a round trip from Belgrade to Madrid. Another clue emerged when Madrid police found stolen license plates in a sewer drain. These plates belonged to a car spotted near Anna's building on the night she disappeared. That same vehicle, a Peugeot 308 with heavily tinted windows, was captured by a toll camera on a Madrid area highway just hours after the suitcase-carrying man left Anna's building. Though the driver wasn't visible, the car and stolen plates painted an incriminating picture. The final piece of evidence came from the Colombian woman who'd helped David translate the messages. Seeing news coverage about Anna's disappearance, she recognized the story from the texts she'd been hired to write. Shocked, she contacted authorities and revealed everything she knew. The net of evidence was now firmly drawn around David Knežević. He had motive, a contentious, high-stakes divorce. He had means, a detailed, prearranged plan, and he'd left traces, however faint, that pointed directly to him. As European investigators reconstructed his movements, David was in South Florida, attempting to liquidate his assets. In the month before Anna's disappearance, he'd sold 6 investment properties totaling $6 million. He was wealthy and had international connections. A clear flight risk. On May 4th, 2024, 3 months after Anna vanished, David Knežević flew from Serbia back to America. He landed at Miami International Airport, perhaps thinking he'd committed the perfect crime undetected. But FBI agents were waiting for him. As he stepped off the plane, he was arrested and charged with kidnapping his wife. The legal proceedings that followed were as complex and international as the investigation itself. David Knežević entered a plea of not guilty. His lawyers argued that U.S. courts lacked jurisdiction to try him for a crime allegedly committed in Spain, and that the evidence was circumstantial. The helmeted figure could have been anyone. But judges rejected these arguments. They saw an overwhelming body of evidence pointing to a carefully orchestrated crime. Bail was denied repeatedly. The man who'd allegedly traveled across continents to commit murder found himself locked in Miami's downtown federal detention center. By November 2024, his charges were upgraded in severity. A federal grand jury indicted him not only for kidnapping, but also for murder. The charges included killing a U.S. citizen abroad and international domestic violence, resulting in death. For Anna's family, the additional charges confirmed their worst fears, but also moved them closer to a terrible form of closure. This is a step toward justice, as we continue searching for and honoring her memory by sharing her story and demanding accountability, her sister said. The trial was poised to be a sensational affair, a complex cross-border case built on a web of circumstantial evidence. But the trial would never happen. On the morning of April 28, 2025, shortly after his detention, David Knežević was found dead in his cell. He'd taken his own life, carrying his secrets with him forever. The man who'd gone to such extreme lengths to control the narrative, to create an alternate reality, had written his own final act, one of despair. His death abruptly and shockingly ended the legal process, but it provided no answers. It offered no comfort to Anna's family. The saddest part of the story remains unresolved. Anna's body has never been found. The man with the suitcase who left her apartment building that cold February evening disappeared into Madrid's darkness. And with him, the last traces of Anna Maria Knežević vanished as well. Did he hide her in that suitcase? Did he transport her body across Europe and dispose of it in some remote, forgotten place? Authorities searched the dense forests of Vicenza, Italy, but found nothing. The truth, it seems, died with David Knežević in his Miami jail cell. The light in Madrid continues to shine, polishing the old buildings and casting long shadows. But for those who know Anna's story, it's a light forever dimmed by the knowledge of the darkness that entered it. Her story stands as a stark reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are those we once loved. Those who shared our lives and dreams until one day those dreams curdled into inescapable horror. Anna traveled to Madrid seeking a fresh start, but all she found was a premature, tragic end. Her final resting place remains a secret her killer took with him to the grave. Story 5. The summer of 2018 in Brooklyn, Iowa, felt like those that came before. A time of long sun-drenched days melting into warm, starlit evenings. It was a season for county fairs, lazy afternoons by the water, and the familiar rhythm of life in a small Midwestern town. For Molly Tibbetts, age 20, it was a summer full of promise and possibility. As a rising sophomore at the University of Iowa, she was home for break, working at a local day camp and spending time with family and her boyfriend. Known for her infectious smile and caring nature, Molly was beloved in her community. A young woman on the cusp of a bright future ahead. But on a sweltering July evening, that future was violently stolen, and the peaceful town of Brooklyn was thrust into a nightmare that would grip an entire nation. Molly Cecilia Tibbetts was born on May 8, 1998. In San Francisco, California. But she considered Iowa her true home. After her parents Rob and Laura divorced when she was in second grade, Molly moved to the Hawkeye State with her mother and 2 siblings. She maintained a close relationship with her father despite the separation. He'd last been with her at his wedding in June 2018. Studying psychology with dreams of earning a doctorate and writing books. Molly was dedicated to her education and diligent in her work. But it was her kindness and empathy that truly defined her. She had a gift for making people feel seen and valued, a quality that drew others to her. Those close to her remember her as a vibrant and compassionate soul, a young woman who stood up for the underdog and believed in the power of kindness. That summer, Molly was staying at her boyfriend Dalton Jack's house in Brooklyn, a tiny town of roughly 1,500 residents, taking care of his dogs while he was away for work. On the evening of July 18, 2018, she put on her running shoes and headed out for a jog, a routine activity for the former cross-country athlete. The sun was beginning its descent, stretching shadows across the cornfields and soybean fields surrounding the area. It was a peaceful setting that masked the horror about to unfold. At approximately 7:30 p.m., Molly was seen running in her neighborhood. Later that evening, she sent a Snapchat message to her boyfriend that appeared to have been taken indoors. This would be her last communication. The next day, Molly didn't show up at her job at Grinnell Regional Medical Center's day camp. At first, her family wasn't overly concerned. Maybe she'd overslept or her phone battery had died. But as hours passed with no word from her, worry began to set in. Her mother, Laura Calderwood, filed a missing person report that same day. The search for Molly Tibbetts had begun. In the early days, the search remained local as family, friends, and townspeople fanned out through the town and surrounding countryside. They combed ditches and farmland, checked abandoned buildings, and knocked on doors looking for any clue about the missing student. But as days stretched into 1 week, then 2, without any sign of Molly, the operation escalated. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, along with FBI agents, joined forces, deploying helicopters, drones, and search dogs. The case quickly captured national media attention, with Molly's smiling face featured prominently on newscasts and online. A Find Molly Tibbetts Facebook page was created, while #miles formally became popular on Twitter, where runners nationwide dedicated their workouts to raising awareness about the dangers women runners face. A reward for information leading to finding her grew beyond $366,000, setting a record for the Regional Crime Stoppers program. Despite the massive search effort and numerous tips coming in, progress seemed stalled. For weeks, there were no new developments, no credible sightings, no suspects. The people of Brooklyn, once emblematic of rural safety and peace, now found themselves consumed by fear and uncertainty. "We live in a community where this doesn't happen," one resident remarked. "But it did happen, and everyone's baffled." Then, 4 weeks after Molly's disappearance, came a major breakthrough. Detectives meticulously reviewing surveillance footage from private security systems spotted something significant: a dark Chevrolet Malibu following a lone female runner. The car appeared repeatedly, passing by during the evening hours of July 18th. They determined the runner must have been Molly Tibbetts. Authorities identified the car as belonging to Christian Bahina Rivera, a 24-year-old farm worker living locally for several years. Rivera was an undocumented immigrant from Mexico, employed at Yarrabee Farms, a dairy operation managed by a family of a prominent Iowa Republican. At first cooperative, denying knowledge of the disappearance, as questioning progressed, Rivera's story shifted. During an extended police interrogation, Rivera finally provided a chilling account. He acknowledged seeing Molly jogging on the evening of July 18th and being attracted to her. After driving past her, he turned around for another look. He told detectives he got out of his vehicle and jogged alongside her, but she threatened to call police. He claimed he then blacked out, and his next memory was being in his car with Molly's body in the trunk. He said he drove to a remote cornfield, carried her remains into the tall stalks, and covered her with corn leaves. He then led investigators to the location, where they found Molly's body exactly as he described. A subsequent autopsy revealed she died from multiple sharp force injuries. News of Molly's death reverberated deeply through her community and across the country. The grief was profound, but it quickly intensified into a contentious political debate. Rivera's status as an undocumented immigrant made him a flashpoint in the national conversation about immigration. However, Molly's family resisted the politicization of her death. At her funeral, her father Rob delivered a moving eulogy, urging attendees to honor his daughter for her life, not her death. He stated that Hispanic people are Iowans, sharing Iowa values. To him, they're Iowans with better food. He condemned those who would use Molly's memory to promote agendas she would have considered deeply racist. In August 2018, Christian Bahina Rivera was charged with first-degree murder. He entered a plea of not guilty, and his trial began in May 2021 after multiple delays. The prosecution built their case on 3 crucial pieces of evidence: surveillance video of Rivera's car, his confession to authorities, and Molly's DNA found in his vehicle's trunk. When you put these puzzle pieces together, there's no alternative but to find the defendant guilty of Molly Tibbetts' murder, the prosecutor declared in his opening statement. The defense, conversely, offered a completely different story. They argued Rivera's confession was coerced during an exhaustive interrogation, and that police had fed him details about the crime. In a shocking development, Rivera testified in his own defense, claiming he'd been kidnapped by 2 masked men who forced him to participate in the crime. He alleged the men placed Molly's body in his trunk and threatened his family if he went to police. This explosive claim appeared out of nowhere. The jury had to weigh two contradictory accounts of what happened that July night. After 7 hours of deliberation, they reached a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. On August 30th, 2021, Christian Bahena Rivera was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The mandatory sentence for this crime in Iowa. Following the verdict and sentencing, Molly's family once again appealed for public focus on her life and impact. They launched the Molly Movement, an online initiative encouraging acts of kindness in her honor. "Our hearts are broken," the family said in a public statement. "On behalf of Molly's family, we thank everyone around the world who has shared their condolences and prayers for our daughter. The murder of Molly Tibbetts is a story of a life cut tragically short, a community's lost innocence, and a nation grappling with complex and divisive issues. But it's also a chronicle of a family's steadfast love and a young woman's enduring legacy of kindness that still inspires others. Ultimately, her family wants the world to remember how Molly lived, not how she died. She was an extraordinary young woman," her father said, "and we will get through this. And in time," he added, "we'll become an extraordinary family." Story 6. The sun rises sharp and fast in the California desert. On March 30th, 1993, that pattern held true. Daylight flooded the rugged peaks of the Coxcomb Mountains, bleaching the sky to a pale, relentless blue and sweeping across the vast, empty expanse of desert center. This is a landscape of geological time, where silence is broken only by the howl of wind and the roar of big rigs thundering along the lonely ribbon of Interstate 10. It's a place of transience, with people traveling from somewhere to somewhere else, a long, scorching corridor linking the promise of California to the arid plains of Arizona. That Tuesday morning, a maintenance worker was conducting a routine check of the eastbound Hayfield Road on-ramp, a desolate arc of pavement serving as a brief pause in the highway's endless story. The landscape was a palette of browns and grays dotted with the stubborn green of creosote bushes. Yet against this muted backdrop, something was starkly out of place. A splash of color, an unnatural shape. As the worker drew closer, the form resolved into that of a person. It was a woman's body, partially clothed and discarded like roadside trash. She lay in the brush and gravel just off the pavement, a silent witness to an ultimate act of violence. The desert had already begun its work, the fierce sun and dry air conspiring to erase her final moments. But they couldn't erase the truth of her end. She had been murdered. Her identity, investigators would soon learn, was Sherry Herrera. She was 30 years old, the mother of 4 children waiting for her return in Tulare, a small city hundreds of miles away in California's Central Valley. The discovery of Sherry's body on that isolated on-ramp didn't end her story. It began an investigation that would echo through the Riverside County Sheriff's Department for nearly 30 years. Who had left her there, and why? The answer would remain hidden, a secret guarded by America's vast, anonymous highway system, and the man who used them as his hunting ground. The long cold case had only just begun. When the call came in, it was just another day for Riverside County Sheriff's Department detectives. Murders in the desert weren't uncommon, a grim feature of terrain that offers both isolation and concealment. But the scene at the Hayfield Road on-ramp was especially bleak. There was an overwhelming sense of abandonment about it. The feeling that Sherry Herrera had been erased not just from life, but from existence itself. The initial investigation was a race against nature and time's relentless march. The crime scene was a surface of dust and gravel, fragile and easily disturbed. Detectives combed the area methodically, searching for anything that might reveal Sherry's identity or her final hours. They found precious little. No purse, no ID, no personal belongings offering clues. The killer had been thorough in stripping away her identity before depositing her in this godforsaken spot. The coroner's preliminary examination at the scene revealed the brutality she'd endured in her final moments. Later official documentation would confirm these grim details. She'd been sexually assaulted and strangled with a belt. Evidence collected from her remains was carefully preserved. Fragments of biological material that in 1993 offered only a slim hope for future justice, as DNA technology was still relatively new, a tool more promising than practical for many cash-strapped departments. Still, swabs were taken, samples logged and refrigerated, a silent plea for a scientific breakthrough still years away. The first priority was identifying the victim. Without it, she remained just another Jane Doe among countless unsolved files. Statewide law enforcement received bulletins matching Sherry Herrera's description. A 30-year-old reported missing from Tulare County days earlier. They quickly linked the name to the case, bringing initial pieces of her life into focus. She was a mother of 4 young children, navigating complexities woven from hardship and survival. Court records later painted her as a known sex worker and drug user who frequented highway rest stops, a stark summary of existence on society's margins. Detectives learned her last confirmed sighting alive occurred when she was dropped off at a rest area between Tulare and Pixley, telling the driver a pickup was arranged 10 minutes later. She was never seen alive again. How had she traveled 250 miles from a Central Valley rest stop to a desolate Mojave Desert ramp? The answer seemed obvious. Truckers. Highways serve as the nation's veins. Truckers steering massive vehicles as its commercial lifeblood. They're a nomadic people, an endless stream of individuals moving from coast to coast. For a woman working at roadside service areas, a long-haul trucker was a likely customer, a possible ride, and, as it turned out, a possible threat. The theory was straightforward and chilling. Sherry had climbed into a cab with someone who meant her harm. Somewhere along the dark stretch of Interstate 10, the arrangement turned deadly. He attacked her, ended her life, and then, with the detached efficiency of someone cleaning up, pulled over at the nearest convenient spot and dumped her body in the wilderness before rejoining the anonymous flow of traffic, a ghost disappearing into the night. Detectives pursued the investigation vigorously. They talked with other women working the rest areas, hoping someone had seen Sherry get into a particular rig. They canvassed truck stops, showing her photo and asking if anyone recognized her. But the world of long-haul truckers is inherently transient. Faces blur and memories fade across distance. No one remembered anything useful. The investigative leads evaporated as quickly as a desert rainstorm. The case that had started with a jolt of violent immediacy gradually lost momentum, fading in urgency with each passing week, then month, then year. For Sherry Herrera's family, the lack of answers was its own agony. Her 4 children were left with an absence, a gaping void where their mother once stood. Her son, Adrian Herrera, was only 6 years old. The memory of the day he learned his mother's fate was seared into his mind, a wound that would never fully heal. I remember coming home from school and my stepmother told us what happened, he would recall years later. My sister and I were there. Of course, we just started crying uncontrollably. For 3 decades, that grief was their only inheritance. The file for Sherry Herrera's homicide was placed in a box and stored on a shelf in the cold case unit. It became one among many folders, each representing a life cut short, families left wondering, and a killer who'd escaped justice. The desert kept its secrets, and the wheels of justice stopped turning. For nearly 30 years, Sherry Herrera's spirit lingered over California's highways. Her file gathered dust, an artifact from an era before digital databases and the forensic revolution that would forever change criminal investigations. But while her case sat dormant, science did not. The fragile biological samples collected from her remains in 1993, once considered a long shot, had become a treasure trove of information waiting to be decoded. In the early 2000s, the FBI launched CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, a nationwide database allowing law enforcement agencies to compare genetic profiles from crime scenes with those of convicted offenders and arrestees across the country. Suddenly, a cold case in California could be solved by an arrest in Florida. The invisible threads connecting violent crimes across state lines became visible for the first time. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department, like many agencies, began systematically submitting DNA from their dormant cases to CODIS, hoping for a match. The evidence from Sherry Herrera's case was entered, a digital ghost in the system waiting for its counterpart. For years, there was no hit. The answer finally came not from California, but from Texas. In April 1992, 1 year before Sherry Herrera's murder, another woman's body, Shinda Denise Hayes, had been found in rural Titus County, Texas. Like Sherry, she'd been sexually assaulted and killed. That case had also gone cold, another file in another cabinet far away. But the Texas Rangers mirrored their counterparts in Riverside County in their determination. They too had preserved DNA evidence, and with advances in forensic genealogy, they managed to build a family tree from the killer's DNA. A groundbreaking technique that had cracked some of America's most notorious cold cases. The genealogical trail led them to one man, Douglas Thomas, a recently retired long-haul truck driver living in Waco, Texas. In May 2022, the Texas Rangers arrested Thomas, then 67, on suspicion of murdering Shinda Hayes. As part of his booking, a DNA sample was taken and entered into CODIS. And then it happened. A computer in a lab somewhere flagged a match. The genetic profile from Texas's 1992 murder scene matched exactly with that from California's 1993 murder scene, Sherry Herrera's case. After 29 years, the ghost on the highway finally had a name. The news hit Riverside County's regional cold case homicide team like a lightning bolt. The team, a dedicated group of investigators from multiple agencies, including the DA's office, Sheriff's Department, FBI, and Riverside Police Department, pulled Sherry Herrera's file from storage. The old photographs, the brittle documents, the story of a mother of 4 abandoned on a desert ramp, all came rushing back into focus. Douglas Thomas's profile fit their original theory perfectly. He'd worked as a long-haul trucker for over 4 decades, traveling extensively throughout America. He was a man whose life unfolded along the interstates, a ghost drifting at the edge of American society. The highways were his office, his home, and his hunting ground. He fit the profile of the killer authorities had long suspected. Members of the Riverside Cold Case team traveled to Texas to interview Thomas in the prison where he was being held. They faced a man in his 70s. Gone was the powerful figure who'd once operated an 80,000-pound truck, now just an elderly inmate in prison garb. But as they questioned him about Sherry Herrera's murder, glimpses of his former self emerged. The details of that interrogation remained confidential, but the outcome spoke volumes. Shortly after the Riverside investigators returned to California, the district attorney's office formally charged Douglas Thomas with Sherry Herrera's 1993 murder. In addition to the murder charge, they added a special circumstance allegation of murder during rape. The announcement of the arrest sent shockwaves through Sherry's family. After 30 years of resigned acceptance that this moment might never come, the call from the DA's office seemed impossible to believe. "I don't think I fully processed it because it's been so long," Adrian Herrera said. The young boy who'd cried in his stepmother's arms had grown into a man, and the justice he'd given up hope for was suddenly within reach. The legal process to bring Thomas to California was complex. First, he had to answer for Shinda Hayes' murder in Texas. In that case, he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and received a sentence of 40 years to life in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. But the Riverside County DA's office was determined he'd also stand trial for Sherry's death. They invoked the Interstate Compact on Detainers, a legal mechanism allowing one state to temporarily hold a prisoner from another state for trial. In August 2025, Douglas Thomas was extradited to California and booked into the Robert Presley Detention Center in Riverside. On September 10, 2025, he appeared in a Riverside County courtroom. At 71 years old, he stood before the judge and firmly entered a plea of not guilty to Sherry Herrera's murder. The trial awaits. A felony settlement conference is scheduled for December 2025. For Sherry Herrera's family, this marks the beginning of the final chapter in a saga that has defined their lives for 30 years. The wheels of justice, stalled for so long, are finally turning. The prosecution's case against Douglas Thomas, built on advances in forensic science and dogged investigative work, stands as proof that no case is ever truly cold, and no victim ever truly forgot. The man who once prowled the highways as an unnamed threat is now just an old man behind bars. His freedom gone? His identity exposed. He's no longer a mystery. He's an accused killer. And for the first time in 3 decades, the story has shifted from the mystery of Sherry Herrera's death to the certainty of her killer facing justice. The desert may hide its secrets, but eventually, truth, like the relentless desert sun, always finds a way to break through. Story 7. In the sun-drenched expanses of South Texas, beneath a sky that stretches vast and relentless, sits the small town of Cotulla. It's a place where time seems to drift more slowly, where family roots run deep in the dry earth, and where the memories of its people are long and cherished. In the summer of 2005, Cotulla was a typical town in LaSalle County, its pace set by the steady hum of the Eagle Ford Shale and the rhythmic pulse of rural life. But on a scorching July day, that rhythm was violently disrupted by a crime so savage and senseless that its reverberations would echo through the town for 20 years, leaving a scar that never quite healed. Valerie Laguna was 26 years old, a young woman on the cusp of a fresh beginning. She was vibrant, filled with the quiet joy and nervous anticipation that comes with pregnancy. 8 months along, her days were occupied with preparations and dreams for the baby she was weeks from holding. Her life, like her hometown, was defined by simple relationships and familiar people. But in the early hours of July 19th, 2005, her fate was stolen from her through an act of inconceivable brutality. She was last seen at a private residence in Cotulla, a final brief glimpse before she vanished into darkness. Later that same day, under the oppressive Texas sun, her body was discovered. The location was one meant for quiet reflection and eternal rest, the Cristo Rey Cemetery. But what greeted investigators was a scene of violation and terror. Valerie hadn't met a peaceful end. She'd been physically assaulted, strangled, and subjected to sexual violence. Her death resulted from severe head trauma caused by blunt force. Her unborn baby, a life barely begun, perished alongside her. This double tragedy sent a shockwave of disbelief and grief across Cotulla, as real as the sweltering heat. A sacred place had been turned into a site of profound and brutal suffering. The initial investigation was a frantic and urgent search for answers. The LaSalle County Sheriff's Office and the Texas Rangers worked tirelessly, pursuing leads, questioning anyone who might have seen something, and collecting evidence from the scene. They suspected the killer was likely from the area. Someone familiar with Cotulla's secluded back roads, someone comfortable in the town's hidden corners. But despite their best efforts, the trails went cold. The investigation, like many others, stalled. The path to the perpetrator faded into the sands of time. For Valerie's family, the years that followed were a painful state of grief without resolution. The lingering questions of who had committed this terrible deed, and why weighed on them constantly like an oppressive cloud. But within Cthulhu's heart, Valerie remained remembered. A sign displaying her smiling face was posted publicly in the town, an enduring reminder of the justice still owed. It stood as proof of a community's determination not to let her fade from memory. A silent vigil maintained by a town that had shared in the family's pain. Every new sheriff and each fresh wave of detectives took on the case as their own solemn duty. The Texas Department of Public Safety announced a reward aimed at drawing vital information from the shadows, but no word came forward. For nearly 2 decades, Valerie Laguna's case file sat dormant, a testament to a mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved. But in forensic science's realm, time can be an ally. Technologies advance, new techniques emerge, and what once seemed impossible becomes routine. The key to solving Valerie's murder lay dormant in an evidence room's refrigerated storage, waiting for scientific progress to match the crime's complexity. A spark of hope emerged in 2020 when Sergeant Omar Olivares Jr., an investigator with LaSalle County Sheriff's Office known for his unwavering resolve to solve cold cases in his jurisdiction, became aware of the Embark system. This novel DNA collection method functions like a tiny wet vacuum, spraying sterile fluid onto evidence, then drawing back the liquid along with any dislodged trace DNA into an ultra-sensitive filter. It's a device capable of extracting genetic markers from surfaces where conventional swabs had failed. Using MVAC is irreversible. Once applied, evidence can't be re-examined. But for a case as old as Valerie's, it was worth the risk. Crime scene materials were sent to Bode Technology, a Virginia-based private lab expert in sophisticated genetic analysis. The MVAC performed its task, and after 15 years, investigators obtained a usable genetic profile, possibly identifying the culprit. This breakthrough marked significant progress, but it was merely the beginning of the journey. The profile represented a phantom, a genetic code lacking identity. Investigators, now equipped with this powerful new clue, gained assistance through the Texas Department of Public Safety's Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, SAKI, a state-funded program supporting investigations into unsolved sexual assaults and murders. This enabled them to begin DNA testing on people who'd been connected to the investigation over the years, however distantly. A match was essential. Slowly and meticulously, they began narrowing the possibilities. They obtained what's called a surrogate sample from someone under scrutiny, a covertly collected DNA specimen from a discarded object like a coffee cup. The preliminary results were encouraging, directing their focus to one individual. Then they succeeded in getting a more direct sample, and the pieces of the genetic puzzle finally fell into place. The DNA pattern from the crime scene matched. After 2 decades of silence, the ghost had a name: Saul Gonzalez. He was 66 years old, living in Cthulhu. A man who'd resided in the same small town as Valerie, breathing the same air, walking the same streets for 20 years, all while harboring the secret of his horrific act. Authorities discovered he'd been acquainted with Valerie, though the specifics of their relationship remain unclear. What was evident was that he wasn't the biological father of her unborn child. On August 29th, 2025, a LaSalle County grand jury indicted Saul Gonzalez for capital murder. He was arrested without incident by the Texas Rangers at the Eagle Ford Crossing, a nearby travel hub. The man who'd avoided punishment for 20 years was finally in custody. The announcement of the arrest sent shockwaves through Cthulhu.rt. For an entire generation, Valerie Laguna's murder had been a dark, unresolved chapter in the town's history. The arrest wasn't just a victory for law enforcement. It was a collective sigh of relief, a release of 20 years of accumulated grief and frustration. Sheriff Hector Ramirez expressed the profound significance of the moment in a press statement. For 2 decades, "This community has carried the weight of a terrible tragedy," he said. "This arrest marks a crucial step toward justice. More importantly, it represents a chance for healing, for the victim's family who waited so long, and for a community that never forgot." The arrest stood as proof of law enforcement's unwavering determination and the unstoppable march of scientific innovation. It was a story made possible by the cooperation of multiple agencies: the Texas Rangers, the DPS Crime Lab, the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification, and Bode Technologies' private experts, all working together to speak for a victim silenced for so many years. Saul Gonzalez, held on a $1 billion bond, now faces trial. The legal battle to hold him accountable for the murders of Valerie Laguna and her unborn child is only beginning. But for family and townspeople who waited 2 decades for an answer, the path to justice has taken an enormous stride forward. Valerie's story serves as a poignant and sorrowful testament that even when leads grow cold and hope fades, the search for truth never ends. It's a promise that no victim is ever forgotten, and that sometimes, after 20 years of darkness, justice's light can finally break through. Story 8. Milwaukee, a sprawling city on Lake Michigan's western shore, was experiencing the last traces of summer in September 2022. While daytime warmth lingered, a crisp edge in the breeze hinted at autumn's approach. For Kania Brunson, age 20, this marked a time of transition, a chapter full of potential for fresh starts and chasing her dreams. Those who knew her described her as a vibrant young woman whose radiant smile could instantly brighten any room. She had a magnetic quality that drew people to her. Her father, Shantai Brunson, would later say with emotion heavy with both love and grief that Kania meant the world to him. A daughter who, in her brief life, had taught him profound lessons about his own character. Kania had aspirations. She'd once wanted to be an orthodontist or a veterinarian, reflecting her compassionate nature. Later, realizing a talent for making others look and feel good, she enrolled in cosmetology school, channeling her creative energy into this new passion. She stood on the threshold of adulthood, navigating life's complexities, matters of the heart, and personal ambitions. Jennifer Meadows, her mother, saw Kania as her best friend, a bond deep and lasting. Their relationship was close, filled with laughter, and the easy familiarity born from years of shared moments. Cameron Meadows, her stepfather, remembered her infectious laugh and how she could make people smile with the smallest things. But beneath this bright and hopeful life lay a dark and complicated relationship that was unraveling. One destined to end in horrific violence. Since her teenage years, spanning several years, Kania had been involved in a secret relationship with Sutan Sheriff. At 53 years old, Sheriff was nearly 3 decades older. A married man leading an entirely separate life and family, apart from what he'd formed with Kania. Their connection was a hidden romance, a secret world of promises and lies. Sheriff himself would later admit, in an understated moment of self-reflection, that it was kind of toxic. The nature of their relationship formed a tangled web of control issues and emotional dependency. Kania, young and perhaps naive, had fallen for the older man. Sheriff had a lengthy criminal history stretching back to 1989, including a 10-year prison sentence for drug possession, and projected an aura of dangerous allure. He was someone used to operating outside legal boundaries, a repeat offender who'd had his parole revoked twice. During his involvement with Kania, he was legally prohibited from contacting her, a clear sign their relationship had already ventured into dangerous territory. As summer 2022 drew to a close, the threads of this secret life began to unravel. Sheriff seemed intent on ending it, but concluding such a long-standing relationship built on unstable ground was never going to be simple. Kania herself wasn't ready to let go. Their dynamic shifted as the underlying toxicity began to erupt. 1 week before Kanya's tragic death, a strange and ominous incident occurred. Suiton Sheriff reached out to Jennifer Meadows. Their conversation served as an eerie foreshadowing of the violence to come. Jennifer later recounted him saying, "I want to stop dealing with your daughter," words that hung in the air like a death sentence. "But she's calling my wife." This was the breaking point. Kania had crossed a line Sheriff wouldn't tolerate, exposing their hidden affair to his wife, threatening his double life. This revelation threw Sheriff into desperation. The man who'd carefully maintained 2 separate worlds now faced their simultaneous collapse. His desire to end the relationship transformed into something much darker, a compulsion to silence Kania forever. September 24th, 2022, dawned like any ordinary Saturday in Milwaukee. But for Kania Brunson, it would be her last day. She met Suiton Sheriff that morning, sealing her fate. What exactly transpired between them initially remains unknown, but their meeting quickly escalated into an episode of extreme violence. A friend of Sheriff's who witnessed the ensuing horror later told law enforcement an account that disturbed even seasoned detectives. He saw Sheriff in his vehicle, pressing down on Kania while she screamed, begging for help, her voice a desperate plea in the morning air. "He cut my throat," she cried out, stark words bearing witness to the assault being inflicted upon her. The witness, horrified by what he saw, called emergency services, relaying the terrible details with a shaking voice. Officers were dispatched immediately, but when they arrived, they found only emptiness where the car had been. Sheriff and Kania had vanished, leaving nothing but the echo of a young woman's screams and an unsettling sense of dread. Kania was formally listed as missing, her family's worst fears beginning to materialize. "I hadn't even been there half an hour when they called to tell me her car had been found," Jennifer Meadows recalled, the memory of that day permanently etched in her mind. "And I knew right then, at that moment, that something terrible had happened to her." A few hours later, another emergency call came in. This time, a report of a fire in an alley near Keefe Avenue and Palmer Street, on Milwaukee's north side. When firefighters and police arrived, they encountered a scene of unspeakable horror. Within the smoky, charred debris, they found a body. It was Kania Brunson. Her life, full of hope and possibility, had been extinguished in the most brutal way imaginable. The subsequent investigation painted a bleak picture of Kania's final moments. The coroner's findings revealed the full extent of the violence she'd suffered. She'd been both stabbed and shot, her wrists bound with wire, details indicating the ruthless and premeditated nature of her attacker. Then, in a final frantic attempt to destroy evidence of his crime, her killer set her body on fire. The gruesome discovery sent shockwaves through the neighborhood and left Kania's family completely shattered. "She meant the world to me," Jennifer Meadows said, her voice heavy with grief so deep it felt almost physical. "She was my everything, and this is the most agonizing pain." The investigation into Kania's murder quickly focused on Suiton Sheriff. Witness statements, the history of their troubled relationship, and Sheriff's ominous call to Kania's mother all pointed to him as the primary suspect. But the inquiry also revealed a disturbing accomplice. Sheriff's brother-in-law, Johnny Hops, faced charges of mutilating a corpse and harboring a criminal. Authorities alleged that after Sheriff murdered Kania, he enlisted Hops's help to dispose of her body, with both men working together to set her remains ablaze in that desolate Milwaukee alley. The case against Sheriff strengthened as detectives pieced together the events of that fateful day. His wife had initially claimed he was with her on the night of the killing, a desperate attempt to provide him with an alibi, but surveillance footage disproved her account, tearing apart the web of lies they'd tried to weave. Sheriff was arrested and charged with first-degree intentional homicide and mutilating a corpse. His bail was set at $500,000, while Hops's was set at $50,000. The wheels of justice had begun turning, but for Kania's family, the road ahead promised to be long and difficult, a painful trek through the maze of the legal system. They wanted justice for Kania and were determined to see it through to the end. There is some comfort in knowing we've identified the suspects and they're facing charges, a family member said, expressing the complex mixture of relief and unease that surrounded them. But still, with all the court delays, postponing hearings and rescheduling dates, it prevents us from finding complete peace. They plan to attend every court hearing, every legal proceeding at each stage. Their presence would serve as a quiet statement of their love for Kania and their unwavering demand for justice. The trial against Sutan Sheriff began in December 2023, over a year after Kania Brunson's brutal murder. The courtroom was saturated with tension, the atmosphere thick with grief and anticipation. Kania's family and friends filled the gallery, many wearing white shirts displaying photos of Kania, her smiling face serving as a poignant reminder of the life so needlessly taken. Our guardian angel, always remembered fondly. The shirts read, "A silent tribute to a daughter, granddaughter, and friend deeply missed." The prosecution presented their case methodically. Witness testimony placed Sheriff at the scene. Forensic evidence linked him to the crime. The story of his controlling relationship with Kania and his desperate desire to silence her was laid bare before the jury. Sheriff took the stand in his own defense, but his testimony rang hollow. He claimed he was 3 to 4 miles away from where Kania's body was burned. He tried to implicate a cousin whose name hadn't been mentioned during the 6-day trial. He portrayed himself as an unfortunate bystander, someone just trying to help a young woman in trouble. "I had some sympathy for her," he said, his tone lacking any genuine emotion. "But as for the rest, I would never have hurt her." His words felt empty in the silence of the courtroom. The jury, composed of 12 ordinary people, had listened carefully to the evidence, their expressions somber. They'd heard the witness accounts, seen the photographs, and absorbed the disturbing details of Kania's final hours. After a trial lasting 6 days, they withdrew to deliberate. It took them just 45 minutes to reach a verdict. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming case built against Sheriff. The verdict was guilty of first-degree intentional homicide, being party to a crime, and mutilating a corpse. A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. For Kania's family, it was a moment of profound relief, a confirmation that their daughter's death hadn't been meaningless. Justice, it seemed, was finally within reach. The sentencing hearing took place in February 2024. It was a time for Kania's family to face the man who'd taken their daughter from them, to express their pain and fury. Shantai Brunson, Kania's father, addressed the court, his eyes locked on Sheriff, his voice trembling with rage that had been building for over a year. He called Sheriff a monster, a demon who'd brutally ended his daughter's life. "If I end up in hell," he cried out, his words a raw and unfiltered expression of his anguish, "I'll see you there." Kania's grandmother, Charlene Litzler, remembered her granddaughter as a vibrant young woman with a beautiful smile who loved going to the state fair with her family. She was headed to college to pursue her dreams until this devil took her life, she said, her voice filled with a grandmother's love and a deep sense of loss. The defense requested that Sheriff be eligible for extended supervision after 20 years, a plea for mercy that struck Kania's family as an insult. But Milwaukee County Circuit Court Judge David Swanson was unmoved. He looked at Sheriff, a man with an extensive criminal record who'd shown no remorse for his actions, and delivered his ruling. Describing Sheriff's conduct as brutal and merciless, he sentenced him to spend the rest of his life in prison without any possibility of parole. The sentence was an absolute declaration that Sutan Sheriff would never get another chance to hurt an innocent person again. For Kania's family, The life sentence represented a form of justice, the final chapter in a period filled with immense pain and grief. "Thank you, Jesus. We got justice for life," Charlene Litzler posted on Facebook. Her words a simple yet powerful testament to their relief. The legal battle had ended, but the grief would persist, a constant companion in the years ahead. The story of Kenia Brunson is a heartbreaking tale of a life cut short, a story of a secret romance turned deadly. It's an account of betrayal's destructive consequences and humanity's darkest impulses. But it's also a story of a family's steadfast love and their determined pursuit of justice. In the end, Kenia's voice wasn't silenced. It resonated through the witnesses' testimonies, the prosecution's evidence, and most poignantly in the grief-stricken faces of her loved ones. Her legacy endures, a testament to the bright, vibrant young woman she was and the dreams she never got to fulfill. The city of Milwaukee will remember her, not for the tragedy of her death, but for the light she brought during her too brief time among them. Story 9. In the damp autumn of 1974, in Memphis, the city pulsed with the untamed spirit of the South. Jazz clubs leaked music into the night. The Mississippi River carried mysteries as it rolled slowly past the bluffs, and young lives balanced between hope and despair. Charles Howard Wallace was 19, a tall, slender young man whose quiet nature hid the turmoil churning inside. A native of Tennessee's heartland, Charles had been raised in a modest home where the air always held the faint smell of fried okra and the distant rumble of freight trains. His family wasn't wealthy, but they were close-knit, the kind that gathered around a worn kitchen table for Sunday dinners, sharing stories that wove together the fabric of their lives. His mother, Evelyn, a seamstress with rough hands from years at her sewing machine, loved her son with a fierce, quiet devotion. She remembered him as the boy who fixed broken toys for his younger siblings, his dark eyes thoughtful even in those early years. But by the fall of 1974, Charles's world had begun to fracture. He'd fallen into addiction, a darkness that crept into his late teens, pulling him away from the familiar streets of his neighborhood. Doctors called it substance abuse, but to Evelyn, it was a thief stealing her son piece by piece. Looking for a way out, Charles enrolled in a halfway house in central Memphis, a low brick building on the edge of Beale Street, where neon signs flickered like false promises. The house was a haven for fresh starts, populated by men like him, haunted by their choices, clinging to the routines of group counseling and structured hours. Charles arrived there carrying a small bag holding little more than spare clothes and a worn Bible given by his father. "Keep this close," his father, Howard, had said, his voice rough from years in the steel mill. "It'll guide you home." The last time Evelyn heard her son's voice was through a crackling phone line in late October. "I'm doing better, Mama," Charles assured her, his speech tinged with the weariness of someone fighting invisible demons. He mentioned plans to find work, maybe at one of the riverside warehouses, and promised to visit soon. Evelyn held tight to those words, replaying them in her mind through the long nights when sleep escaped her. Howard, ever the stoic supporter, comforted her that young men like Charles needed space to heal. But as days became weeks and then months, communication stopped. The holidays came and went without a car or call. By spring 1975, worry had carved deep lines into Evelyn's face. She traveled to the halfway house only to learn Charles had left abruptly, his bed empty for months. Nobody knew where he'd gone. Perhaps back to the streets, chasing the highs that had trapped him, or maybe further away, lured by whispers of opportunities beyond the state line. His family searched as best they could. Howard visited homes in Memphis's seedier neighborhoods, showing an old photo of Charles smiling carefree from his high school graduation. Evelyn distributed flyers in laundromats and cafes, her hands trembling as she taped them up while humidity curled their edges. They filed a missing person report with local police, who were overwhelmed, their desks piled with cases from a city struggling with rising crime. "He'll turn up," one detective said sympathetically, but it sounded like empty reassurance. Time faded. Searches dwindled. Hope waned. Life continued. Howard worked longer hours at the factory. Evelyn took on extra sewing jobs to stay busy. Siblings, now teenagers, whispered privately, wondering whether their brother was alive somewhere, guilt-ridden or gone permanently. The year 1977 began with bitter cold. Dawn. In Lee County, Arkansas, vast fields of cotton stretched in white-capped waves beneath a fierce sun. The earth bore the legacy of laborers' hardship. Rains changed the terrain. Congregations gathered for worship, shared meals, weekend sports. Marianna, the county seat, was a compact town of brick shops with sagging porches where residents knew each other's business. U.S. Route 79 cut through like an artery linking Memphis to Little Rock, pavement humming with occasional roars of trucks carrying goods to market. January 13th. A farmer named Elias Thornton was working his land several miles west of Marianna. Dawn was breaking, frost still coating the furrows, the chill piercing. The air smelled of plowed dirt and distant chimney smoke from nearby homesteads. Elias, a man in his 60s with a lined face reflecting a lifetime of sunrise to sunset work, drove his old John Deere tractor down a familiar path. The motor's rumble, the only sound breaking the countryside's quiet. Reaching the field's edge where the roadside merged into wild vegetation, the plow struck something immovable. The tractor lurched violently, prompting Elias to cut the engine and jump down with a low curse. He expected a boulder or tree stump, remnants of the land's stubborn history. But what he unearthed sent a chill through him deeper than the winter air. Brushing away soil, Elias uncovered bones, human bones, scattered and bleached by time. A skull stared upward, its hollow eye socket seeming to accuse him in the dim light. Fragments of ribcage and limbs were tangled with roots of wild plants. His heart pounded as he backed away, the taste of fear sharp on his tongue. This wasn't an animal. This was a person, left to nature like discarded waste. Elias stumbled to his truck, hands shaking as he radioed the sheriff's office. Within hours, the quiet farmland transformed into a busy crime scene. Deputies roped off the area with yellow tape that fluttered like ghosts in the wind. Their boots sank into soft ground as they carefully searched the area. The Arkansas State Police were called. Their detectives arrived in unmarked cars, expressions grim beneath wide-brimmed hats. The remains were incomplete, skeletal, stripped of soft tissue or clothing that might provide clues. They were identified as belonging to a male, believed to be aged 16 to 30, deceased for anywhere from 6 months to 5 years. The bones showed no obvious signs of trauma. No gunshot wounds or fractures indicating violent death, but the cause and manner of death remained mysteries to the experts. The medical examiner's office at the Arkansas State Crime Laboratory took custody, transporting the fragile remains to Little Rock in secure containers. There, beneath fluorescent lights in a sterile room smelling of formaldehyde, pathologists pieced together what fragments they could. Dental records were compared with local missing persons. Attempts were made to obtain fingerprints, though weathering had erased them. No matches emerged, no wallet, no jewelry, no means of identification. The person was designated a John Doe. Lee County John Doe, filed away in forgotten cabinets, his life reduced to a case number. News spread quickly through Marianna. In the town's diner, residents gathered over coffee and pastries, speculating in hushed tones. Maybe a drifter, one farmer suggested, stirring sugar into his cup, or someone running from the law. Elias Thornton couldn't shake the image of those skeletal remains from his mind. He spent sleepless nights wondering about the life that had ended in his field. Who was this unknown person, discarded without dignity like trash? The community grieved quietly, a prayer during the next church service, a feature in the local paper that soon faded from memory. But for investigators, the case remained a nagging concern. Detective Harlan Brooks, a veteran member of the Arkansas State Police, led the initial investigation. He canvassed rest stops along Highway 79, questioned drifters in Memphis flophouses, and even followed tips to Chicago where rumors of a runaway matched the profile. Every dead end added to their frustration. The file grew with unanswered questions. Years melted into decades. The 1980s brought Reagan's America, its economic ups and downs touching rural Arkansas. Lee County's fields continued to be planted and harvested, but society evolved. Televisions glowed with colorful images. Computers hummed in police stations. The John Doe file was occasionally revisited and cross-checked with emerging national systems. In 2009, it was entered into NamUs, National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, a federal database designed to connect cases across state lines. Harlan Brooks retired in 1985, passing responsibilities to newer detectives, but the mystery persisted like fog over lowlands. Families in Memphis and elsewhere maintained their silent vigils. Evelyn Wallace, now in her 60s, kept Charles's room intact, a shrine decorated with old posters and preserved flowers from fields past, attending support groups for families of the missing, while steadfastly recounting his story, hoping someday clarity would come. By the 2010s, technological advances began reshaping cold case investigations. DNA analysis, once experimental, grew powerful enough to solve puzzles that baffled earlier eras. In March 2024, a specialized unit within the Arkansas State Police Cold Case Unit, focused on such lingering mysteries, turned attention to Lee County John Doe. Under the leadership of Colonel Mike Hagar, known for his tenacity, the team retrieved the original evidence from storage, those fragile relics preserved in acid-free containers. The evidence room's atmosphere was stale, heavy with the passage of time. "This one's waited long enough," Hagar told his team, his voice echoing off metal racks. They collaborated again with the Arkansas State Crime Laboratory, obtaining possible genetic material from the skeletal remains. Samples were scant and deteriorated from prolonged exposure, but hope rested with a Texas facility, Othram, innovators in forensic genetic genealogy. Othram stood apart from conventional forensic labs. It was a hub of innovation using cutting-edge techniques to reconstruct family trees from fragments of DNA. The skeletal remains were sent to the Texas woods, where researchers in lab coats worked beneath softly whirring ventilation hoods, decoding DNA that told stories of ancestry and sorrow. Time passed in anxious anticipation. By June 2025, a report arrived with shocking impact. The remains showed a preliminary match to Charles Howard Wallace, a man who'd vanished from Memphis. The genetic investigation pointed to two possible relatives in Tennessee, branches on a family tree that had been neglected for years. Hagar's unit acted swiftly. Investigators traveled to Tennessee, approaching homes in quiet neighborhoods where the Wallace family had aged into settled routines. Evelyn, now in her 80s, frail yet sharp-eyed, greeted them on her porch, the very spot from which she'd last said goodbye to Charles. Hearing of the genetic connection, her hand covered her mouth, and tears traced paths down her weathered face. "My son," she whispered, the words heavy with half a century of grief. A family member provided a DNA sample, a simple cheek swab, modest yet meaningful. It was sent back to Othram, and on September 2nd, 2025, confirmation came. The bones belonged to Charles. He would have been 21 at his death, his life halted in its youthful promise. The announcement spread among the family like a stone, disturbing calm waters. Howard, deceased for 10 years, would have nodded gravely, his faith validated. Siblings gathered, sharing memories of Charles's laugh, his gentle way with animals, the dreams he'd once shared becoming an auto mechanic. For Evelyn, the resolution mixed sorrow with relief. A son returned, but in fragments, recovered from distant ground. "I never believed he left us willingly," she told a local reporter. her voice steady even as her hands trembled slightly. The identification provided answers long awaited, but mysteries persisted. What had drawn Charles from the halfway house into obscurity? Did he catch a ride across the river, seeking refuge in Arkansas's anonymity? The circumstances surrounding his death remained hidden. No trauma was apparent, yet the location's remoteness hinted at foul play or accident. Perhaps an overdose during a desperate escape. In Lee County, Elias Thornton's descendants now farmed the property, but the story of the bones had become local lore, passed through generations like legend. When the identification made headlines, Mariana buzzed with renewed interest. At the same diner, years later, patrons reflected on the unknown person who'd lain in their soil. Detective Brooks, long retired, saved the news clipping from his paper. A quiet satisfaction in knowing justice, or at least clarity, had prevailed. Colonel Hagar addressed journalists on September 5, 2025, positioned at a podium in Little Rock, with the state seal gleaming behind him. "This investigation demonstrates our commitment," he stated deliberately. "No mystery is left behind." The partnership with Othram and the crime lab underscored a modern era where scientific progress spanned the gap of decades. Yet the emotional core of the story pulsed in quiet moments. Evelyn placed a simple memorial near her flower bed, a plain stone engraved with Charles's name and lifespan. Born 1955, disappeared 1974, identified 2025. She spoke with him there, among whispering leaves, picturing the man he could have become. The tension of those missing years and the burden of unresolved grief had found closure. But Charles Howard Wallace's story was one of persistence. His family's unwavering devotion, detectives' relentless efforts, and terrain that kept his secrets until revelation was inevitable. Ultimately, it was a story of connection salvaged from nothingness, evidence that stories see completion even beyond life's end. Story 10. The dry wind that swept across Las Vegas in the spring of 1995 carried with it the smell of heat-baked asphalt and fleeting possibilities. This was a city built on illusions, a place where fortunes were made and lost on a single card flip, and where new identities could be created as easily as the neon signs that lit up each night. For Joan Albanese, a 39-year-old single mother of two, Las Vegas represented not a world of gambling, but one of steady work and quiet hope. She'd built a life for herself and her teenage daughters, a stable existence far from the turbulence of her youth. Originally from France and having traveled throughout Europe with her family, Joan had a cosmopolitan air that her job at the MGM Grand Hotel and Casino couldn't quite mask. She had a smile that friends called infectious, a warmth that drew people in. Her marriage to Tom Albanese, her daughter's father, had ended in December 1991, leaving her to navigate the challenges of single parenthood alone. She faced this with a strength her daughters admired, building a home full of love and routine amid the city's constant hum. But there was a void, a quiet longing for companionship that had been absent for years. In March 1995, that longing seemed to be fulfilled. At a local gym, a space of exertion and self-improvement, she met John Edwards. He worked as a fitness trainer, his physique reflecting his profession, but it was his charm that was truly captivating. He had an easy confidence, a way of making her feel seen and special. He showed immediate interest not just in her, but also in her daughters, a gesture that touched Joan's watchful maternal heart. For someone who prioritized her children's well-being above everything, this was deeply appealing. He seemed to be the missing piece, a strong and caring man who could complete their family picture. The early months were a whirlwind of growing affection. John Edwards was attentive, engaging, and seemingly devoted. He moved in, and for a brief, hopeful span, it seemed Joan's search for happiness had finally ended. Her daughters, perhaps holding the natural wariness of teenagers, watched their mother's joy, and temporarily, that was enough. But beneath the polished surface of John Edwards lurked another persona. The city of illusions had attracted a master of deception, and the character of John Edwards was his most elaborate fiction to date. The change was gradual at first, almost imperceptible. A flash of irritation that seemed excessive for the trigger. A question about her whereabouts that felt less like interest and more like interrogation. The attention that once felt reassuring began to seem oppressive. His presence became a weight rather than support. The man who'd seemed so transparent and appealing turned controlling and manipulative. Joan's sister noticed it, a keen observer who never warmed to her sister's new partner. She detected a calculating coldness in him, a sense he wanted something beyond love, perhaps wealth, perhaps something darker. The argument started quietly at first, then escalated into shouting that echoed through the home, heard by Joan's oldest daughter. The house that had been a refuge transformed into a zone of tension. The infectious smile that had defined Joan began to fade, replaced by an anxious, worried expression. She confided her concerns to her mother, her voice tight with growing dread she was just beginning to acknowledge. The relationship was flawed. John wasn't the person he'd pretended to be. She planned to end it. On Saturday, August 19th, 1995, Joan made a decision. She told her mother she would break things off with John over dinner that evening, a brave move by a woman reclaiming her life and home for herself and her children. It was also the last decision she would ever make. The next day, Sunday, August 20th, was a bright, scorching Las Vegas afternoon. Tom Albanese drove his daughters back to their mother's house after their weekend visit with him. Upon arrival, they saw John's pickup truck parked on the street, a mute, ominous sight. The girls entered, calling out for their mother. The house was strangely silent, yet charged with disturbing energy. Lights blazed in every room, wasting energy against the daylight. Their mother's bedroom door stood open, but there were no signs, no notes or messages indicating departure. Only essentials like purses left behind, which heightened alarm. Eventually, Tom Albanese reported his ex-wife missing. Family and friends insisted she'd never abandon her children under any circumstances. She was a devoted mother, and the idea of her vanishing without explanation wasn't just inconsistent with her character. It was unimaginable. Attention quickly turned to John Edwards, the man Joan had intended to leave. But when law enforcement arrived to question him, they found he'd disappeared just as completely as Joan. His vanishing was too clean, too sudden. Detectives searched the room he'd rented in a Las Vegas home and made a shocking discovery that revealed the first layer of his fabricated life. They found 2 wallets. One contained identification for Jay Stone. The other held credentials for John Patrick Addis. There was no documentation for John Edwards. The man Joan Albanese had welcomed into her life and home was a phantom, a ghost using an identity stolen from a Florida man. The name John Patrick Addis revealed a dark and troubling past. He wasn't just a con artist. He'd previously been an Alaska state trooper. Beyond that, he'd been a skilled investigator. Someone with exceptional talent for forensic science who'd once taught fellow officers the craft of analyzing crime scenes. He understood police methods. He knew how to erase his tracks. The hunter had become the hunted, and he was expert at evading capture. His history was littered with destruction. His first marriage to a woman in remote Alaska ended in divorce after she fled his physical abuse. He remarried, but his temperament only worsened. In 1986, following a bitter custody battle, he kidnapped his own 4 children and fled to Michigan. He lived there for a year until a wanted poster at a local gym led to his arrest. He was convicted of parental kidnapping and received a 4-year prison sentence, but was released on parole in 1988 after serving roughly 18 months. He immediately violated parole and vanished, embarking on a nomadic lifestyle throughout the United States, using charisma and multiple aliases to blend in. He frequently worked as a fitness trainer, a position giving him access to numerous unsuspecting people. Joan Albanese wasn't his first victim, but authorities began to suspect she might be his first murder victim. The investigation into Joan's disappearance became a manhunt for an exceptionally cunning and dangerous fugitive. 3 days after she went missing, a hiker in a remote, rugged area of Arizona known as Hell's Canyon near Prescott came across Joan's 1993 Honda Accord. The location, miles from the Mexican border, suggested a planned escape route. Police meticulously examined the vehicle, but the man who'd once taught crime scene analysis had left no evidence. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no physical proof suggesting violence. Only the abandoned car and the vast, harsh terrain remained. For 3 long years, the case stagnated. For Joan's daughters and family, it was an era of excruciating uncertainty. They grieved for a woman they instinctively knew was dead, yet without a body or definitive confirmation, a fragment of unlikely hope persisted. They were trapped in limbo between mourning and doubt, their lives permanently fractured by that August weekend. Then, in October 1998, the waiting ended. A hunter, traveling through the same desolate expanse of Hell's Canyon, found skeletal remains approximately 1 mile from where Joan's car had been discovered. Through dental records, authorities confirmed the remains belonged to Joan Albanese. Given the condition of the bones, a precise cause of death couldn't be determined, but the circumstances left no ambiguity. This was murder. An arrest warrant was issued for John Patrick Addis on murder charges. In November 1998, the former police officer was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. While Joan's family could finally give her a proper burial, her killer remained as elusive as ever. But he hadn't simply faded away. He'd crossed borders once more and established another life built on lies, under yet another guise. In late 1996, someone calling himself Jay Stone entered Gold's Gym in Guadalajara, Mexico. A charming, fit American, an exotic figure. He soon met Laura Liliana Casillas Padilla, a local woman aged 26. Just like with Joan Addis, now Stone swept Laura off her feet. Her family watched anxiously as she fell deeply in love and eventually eloped with the mysterious American, their hearts gripped by unspoken dread. In March 1997, a strange ripple from his past life crossed the border. A talk show featured Joan Albanese's disappearance and the manhunt for John Addis. A viewer who'd visited Guadalajara recognized someone matching his description working at a gym. She relayed this tip to authorities through her own network of informants. The gym manager, probably unknowingly, informed Stone that a woman had inquired about someone resembling him. That was all he needed to hear. By the time investigators arrived, he'd vanished. Both he and Laura had disappeared, plunging her family into despair and leaving authorities trailing behind once more. For the next 9 years, there was no sign of John Addis or Laura Padilla. The leads completely dried up. It seemed the Phantom had finally managed to disappear permanently, taking another unsuspecting woman with him. He fathered 2 more children, both young girls, establishing yet another household under an assumed identity, this time posing as a Canadian expat named Charles Peterson, teaching English and tennis in Chiapas, Mexico. The final horrifying chapter of John Addis's story began to unfold on October 18th, 2006. In the southern Mexican state of Chiapas, approximately 1,500 miles from Guadalajara, neighbors near a Canadian man known as Charles Peterson detected a strong odor coming from his home. They hadn't seen the man, his wife, or their 2 small daughters for several days. When police entered the home, they encountered a terrible sight. The bodies of Laura Liliana Casillas Padilla and her 2 daughters, aged 7 and 4, lay on their beds. They'd been dead for days, having succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning. Near Laura's body, investigators found more than 20 syringes, a detail adding another layer of dark mystery to the scene. John Addis, or Charles Peterson, was nowhere to be found. The initial assumption was that Addis had killed his family and was once again on the run. But 2 days earlier, on October 16, 2006, in a hotel room in Guatemala City, 575 miles south of Chiapas, Guatemalan authorities had found a man's body. There were no signs of violence. After being informed of the triple murder in Mexico, investigators shared information and exchanged data. Fingerprints were compared and confirmed a match. The dead man in the Guatemalan hotel was John Patrick Addis. Law enforcement from 3 nations reconstructed his final moments. They concluded that on October 14th, Addis killed Laura and his 2 young daughters. He then fled across the border into Guatemala, checking into a hotel where 2 days later, his body failed him. An autopsy revealed that the man who'd evaded justice for so long and inflicted so much death and pain hadn't been stopped by law enforcement bullets or judicial punishment. At 56 years old, John Patrick Addis died of a heart attack. The ghost was finally gone. His reign of terror, spanning from the frozen wilds of Alaska to the warm streets of Mexico, had ended. He left behind a trail of broken lives, a first wife who escaped his abuse, children he abducted, and at least 4 people he murdered. Joan Albanese, a hopeful mother in Las Vegas. Laura Padilla, a young woman in love in Guadalajara, and his own 2 little girls. The man who'd begun his career enforcing the law spent years perverting it, using his deep understanding of investigative work to become a nearly perfect criminal. He died as he'd lived for many years, alone under a false name, a fugitive from a past that finally overtook him, not with gunfire, but with the silent ultimate betrayal of his own heart. Story 11. The air in Catahoula Parish, Louisiana is thick and humid, clinging to your skin like a second layer. It hangs heavy among the dense groves of pine and cypress, a blanket of moisture that muffles sound and slows time. In this region, the forests keep secrets. They swallow light, their tangled undergrowth forming a maze of shadow and silence. It was in these woods, on a quiet, warm day in early October 2010, that a group of hunters stumbled upon a secret the forest hadn't held for long, a horror so profound it would tear a hole in the fabric of this quiet rural community and send shockwaves across the nation. They were making their way through the trees near Harrisonburg when one of them noticed something. A small shape partially hidden by leaves and the natural debris of the forest floor. It was a child, a little girl, her life snuffed out with a savagery that defied comprehension. The hunters, men familiar with the rhythms of life and death in nature, were deeply shaken by what they saw. This death didn't fit the natural order. This was the work of a monster. The call to the Catahoula Parish Sheriff's Office shattered the afternoon's peace. The crime scene was a place of deep sorrow. The deceased was a girl, later identified as 12-year-old Lexus Roberts. She'd been shot multiple times, and her throat had been cut. It was an act of unspeakable brutality, a terrible final end to a short life. Who was she? How did she end up in this remote Louisiana forest, so far from everything? As detectives began the painstaking work of reconstructing her final moments, they uncovered a story of stolen innocence, of maternal love, and of an elusive predator who'd emerged from the past into their lives with devastating effect. The trail didn't begin in Louisiana. It started over 1,000 miles away in the glittering, sun-scorched desert of Las Vegas. Life for Susan Roberts and her daughter Lexus was a quiet tapestry, woven with threads of ordinary dreams and struggles. Susan, at 31, was a single mother navigating the often challenging landscape of raising a child alone. She was devoted to Lexus, her world centered on the cheerful, bright 12-year-old who stood on the cusp of adolescence. They lived in Las Vegas, a city of bright lights and harsh realities, but their life was far from the glamour of the Strip. It consisted of school runs, shared meals, and the simple routine moments that form the foundation of family. In the summer of 2010, a new thread was woven into their lives. Suelen was renting a storage unit at a local facility, a mundane task amid organizing her affairs. It was there she met Thomas Stephen Sanders. He was 53 years old, an employee at the facility, quiet and seemingly ordinary. Sanders was a man with a past, but it was a past so strange, so bizarre. It seemed to come from fiction. In 1994, 16 years earlier, he'd been declared legally dead. After a divorce from his wife in 1988, who'd accused him of persistent cruel and inhuman treatment, he'd disappeared. His family, his parents, his sibling, his ex-wife sought a Mississippi court's declaration of his death so his children could receive survivor benefits. For 16 years, Thomas Sanders had existed as a ghost, a legal phantom. He drifted through life unnoticed, even managing to be arrested and jailed without his actual status as a deceased person ever being discovered. To Suelen, he was just Tom, someone who showed her kindness and attention. A relationship began to form. For about 2 months, they dated. Sanders seemed to be integrating into their small family unit. He became a fixture in their lives, a man earning the trust of both mother and daughter, trust that would prove fatally misplaced. As summer neared its end, Sanders proposed a trip. A final adventure before school started in earnest. He suggested a journey over Labor Day weekend to Arizona Wildlife World, a popular drive-through safari park near Arizona's Grand Canyon, sounding like an adventure offering Lexus views of bears and buffalo, a chance for all three to create happy memories together. Suelen agreed. On Friday, September 3rd, 2010, the day before departure, Sanders visited a local Walmart in Las Vegas. The store's ever-watchful security cameras captured him navigating the aisles. He wasn't buying travel snacks or supplies. He stood in the sporting goods section, purchasing ammunition. A small, seemingly trivial action, yet sinister evidence of premeditation, an omen of the atrocity to come. The trip itself reportedly went smoothly. They drove several hours from Las Vegas to Williams, Arizona. They spent 3 days touring the wildlife park, Lexus likely captivated by the thrill of seeing wild animals up close. In every meaningful sense, they were a family enjoying a holiday weekend. The final photographs of Lexus and her mother alive were taken there in Arizona on September 4th. They were smiling, frozen in a brief moment of happiness, unaware they were on the brink of unspeakable horror. It was during the return trip that the facade of normalcy shockingly fell away. While driving back to Nevada on Interstate 40, Sanders suddenly pulled the vehicle off the road. He chose an isolated, barren spot in the vast, empty stretches of the Arizona desert. This wasn't a stop to enjoy the scenery or stretch their legs. This was the place he'd planned for. What followed was savage, merciless killing. In a later confession to authorities, Sanders admitted his actions. He aimed his gun at Suelen Roberts, the woman who'd trusted him and welcomed him into her and her daughter's life. He shot her in the head, ending her life in a sudden burst of violence in the desolate desert landscape. For 12-year-old Lexus, her world collapsed in that instant. She watched her mother murdered. The man who'd been a friendly presence, who'd just spent a holiday with them, had transformed into a monster. The psychological trauma of that moment is beyond comprehension. Her protector, her anchor, her entire world had vanished, killed before her eyes, and she was now alone, stranded in the wilderness with her mother's killer. Sanders forced the terrified and grief-stricken child back into the car. He was now not only a murderer, but also a kidnapper. He had a witness to his crime, a 12-year-old girl, and he needed to decide her fate. His travels weren't over. With Lexus as his prisoner, he continued driving, leaving Suelen Roberts' body in the harsh Arizona desert and heading eastward into the heart of the country, dragging a traumatized child along on a journey into deeper despair. For days they traveled. The car became Lexus's prison cell, a moving cage of terror and grief. Each mile took her further from home and everything she'd ever known. She was at the mercy of the man who'd just killed her mother. The emotional agony she must have experienced on that trip is unimaginable. Was she silent, paralyzed by fear? Did she cry? Did she beg for mercy? The details of those days in captivity are known only to her and her killer, but they paint a scene of unspeakable suffering. Sanders crossed the country as a fugitive with a young hostage, a living witness to his crime. His destination was unclear. He was simply running, a predator trying to escape accountability for his actions. His flight finally ended in the thick, humid forests of Catahoula Parish, Louisiana, a place worlds away from Arizona's arid landscape. It was here in a secluded wooded area that Sanders decided to eliminate his only witness. He took Lexus from the car and led her into the trees. And there, under the suffocating humidity of Louisiana's woods, he committed his second act of horrific cruelty. He fired 4 shots into the 12-year-old girl's body, then slit her throat with a knife before leaving her concealed in the dense foliage. The discovery of Lexus's body on October 8th launched a massive multi-state investigation led by FBI agents. Their first challenge was identifying their young victim. Once she was recognized as Lexus Roberts from Las Vegas, everything began falling into place quickly, revealing where Sewell might be, since both were connected to Thomas Stephen Sanders. Details surrounding the ill-fated trip southward earlier that year led up to tragic events. Sanders became the primary person of interest, given his legal status as officially deceased. A nationwide manhunt was issued, broadcasting his image far and wide. The chilling tale of a dead man accused of kidnapping and murder held public attention firmly through media coverage, lasting a little over a month before his capture occurred, ending his reign of terror. On November 16, 2010, almost a month after Lexus's body was found, Thomas Sanders was arrested in Gulfport, Mississippi, at a roadside motel, a quiet, anticlimactic end to a violent spree. At first, he pleaded not guilty, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. His confession, captured by law enforcement in his own chilling words, described the murders of both mother and daughter. The trial in Louisiana's Western District was deeply distressing. Jurors heard the details of Sewell Roberts' brutal killing and the subsequent kidnapping and vicious murder of her daughter. In September 2014, 4 years after the crime, Thomas Stephen Sanders was convicted. The jury then faced the task of determining his sentence. Because of the heinous nature of the crimes, prosecutors sought the death penalty. On September 26, 2014, the jury delivered its decision. Sanders was sentenced to death. It was the first federal death penalty handed down in the Western District of Louisiana, reflecting the profound horror the case had stirred in the community and across the country. For Sewell and Lexus Roberts' family, the verdict represented a step toward justice, though one that could never fully compensate for their loss. Assistant Attorney General Leslie Caldwell captured this sentiment, saying, "A young girl watched her mother murdered, was kidnapped and held for days, and then had her life brutally and senselessly taken. It was hoped," she said, "that the verdict would bring some measure of comfort to Lexus's family as they continued grieving." But the story of Thomas Sanders and his crimes hadn't ended. It was about to take another strange and politically charged turn. Sanders spent 10 years on federal death row. Then, in December 2024, during the final weeks of his term, President Joe Biden commuted all federal death sentences for inmates on death row, Sanders included. His sentence was changed to life imprisonment without possibility of release. For the victims' families and the prosecutors who'd fought for his execution, this was a shocking and heartbreaking development. Catahoula Parish District Attorney Brad Burgett was furious. He saw Biden's clemency as a betrayal of justice for a 12-year-old girl who'd suffered an appalling death. He declared that if federal authorities wouldn't execute Sanders, Louisiana would. In an unprecedented move, in April 2025, a Catahoula Parish grand jury charged Thomas Sanders with state-level first-degree murder for Lexus Roberts' death. The district attorney announced his intention to seek the death penalty once again, effectively subjecting Sanders to another capital trial. The state had previously deferred to federal authorities for prosecution, which secured justice for Lexus, Burgett noted. But President Biden chose to commute Sanders' federal death sentence to life in prison, preserving the life of a convicted child murderer over that of his victim. Thus, Lexus Roberts' case continues, a legal battle that refuses resolution, standing as evidence of an ongoing pursuit for justice proportionate to the crime's severity. Thomas Sanders, once a ghost, now sits in a prison cell, his fate once again uncertain. The forests in Catahoula Parish stand quiet and watchful. They hold the memory of what happened there, an indelible mark upon the landscape. It's a story about a young girl whose joy was prematurely extinguished, about a mother whose life was taken through an act of callous betrayal, and about a murderer who emerged from obscurity into their lives, leaving widespread devastation. It's a tragedy that spans from Arizona's arid lands to Louisiana's humid bayous, a calamity whose repercussions still echo in courtrooms and in the hearts of those who remember the child named Lexus. Story 12. The wind coming down from the mountains onto the Kanto Plain carried the scent of change. It was the late 1950s, a time when Japan was furiously rebuilding itself from the devastation of war. A country suspended between the ghosts of its past and the bright, uncertain promise of what lay ahead. In the rural villages scattered across the region, life moved at a slower, more deliberate pace, governed by the rhythms of nature and the weight of tradition. Yet, even in these quiet corners of Saitama and Tochigi prefectures, the currents of a modern age were beginning to stir, bringing new hopes, new desires, and new, darker temptations. In Kumagaya, a woman named Kyo Kobayashi watched this changing world with a calculating eye. To those around her, she seemed a picture of quiet industry, an attractive wife and later widow, a small business owner selling bicycle tires and traditional sweets, someone who'd endured hardship with steely resilience. Approaching her 5th decade, her face presented a mask of calm propriety, a surface on which time had sketched a portrait of modest perseverance. But beneath this exterior, behind the polite bows and careful speech, lived a heart as cold and hard as stone, a mind that calculated profit and loss with ruthless precision, and a spirit hollowed out by years of bitterness. Further north, beneath the shadow of Mount Nikko, stood the Hotel Nanko, a modest establishment that had fallen on hard times. Its owners, Kamasuke and Yumi Akata, were struggling to keep their dream alive, their days filled with the quiet anguish of financial collapse. Their paths were destined to intersect with Kyo Kobayashi's in a collision of ambition and desperation that would end in violence and cement, a tragedy that would make Kyo the first woman to face execution in post-war Japan. The story of the Hotel Nankau case, as it came to be known, is more than just a chronicle of murder. It's a tale of how the ordinary struggles of daily life can curdle into horrific evil. How a woman's quiet hunger for a life she felt she deserved could lead her into an abyss of unimaginable darkness. Kyo was born in 1908 in a tiny farming village in Saitama, the second of 7 children in a household where poverty was a constant presence. From childhood, survival taught her about scarcity. There was always too little food, too little warmth, never enough of anything except work. After basic schooling, her early years were devoted to the endless tasks of a poor farm family. It was a life devoid of tenderness. A harsh grind had planted in her a deep and lasting hunger for something better, an ache for the comfort and security that always seemed just beyond reach. At 16, She fled farm labor for the big city of Tokyo, working as a maid in the Hongo district. There, she glimpsed another world, one of wealth and ease, where life wasn't an endless struggle for survival. The contrast between her employers' lives and her own impoverished background only deepened her sense of being cheated. It planted a seed of bitterness that would grow and flourish in the fertile soil of her dissatisfaction. In 1930, she returned to her home prefecture and married Hidenosuke Hayashi, a man 7 years her senior, who ran a small shop in Kumagaya Dada. Outwardly, it was a step up. She was no longer a peasant girl or a servant, but a shopkeeper's wife. But her marriage revealed another kind of poverty. Hidenosuke was an ill man, suffering from chronic stomach ailments and venereal disease. A weak and disappointing partner, unable to provide the physical passion or thriving life she craved. They had 2 children. A son who died in infancy. A grief that became just another burden to bear. And a daughter who survived. World War II brought further upheaval. Hidenosuke was drafted, but his frail condition led to injury and his return home. In the chaotic, morally ambiguous world of post-war Japan, Kyo found her calling. As Hidenosuke's health declined further, she became the family's driving force. They started dealing in illegal goods, rubber, rice, sugar, the essentials of a black market economy thriving amid the ruins of the old order. Kyo thrived on it, her sharp mind and relentless drive increasing their earnings. She supplemented their income by selling kekigori, traditional sweets. But it was the thrill of illegal trade, the quick money and sense of outwitting authorities, that truly ignited her soul. This business introduced another man into her world, one who would awaken dangerous new aspects of her ambition. Majiro Nakamura was a young policeman, only 25, sent to investigate rumors of black market dealings at the Hayashi residence. But instead of enforcement, he found seduction. Kyo deployed charm, offering him hospitality both flattering and beguiling. Nakamura, affected by the attention and perhaps lonely, found himself drawn into her sphere. He became a frequent visitor, a companion to the household. For Kyo, trapped in a loveless marriage with an ailing husband, the attractive young policeman was a spark in the dull monotony of her life, a source of the physical fulfillment she'd long been denied. A secret affair began, a hidden connection that gave her the passion she'd been missing. But for Kyo, this entanglement wasn't just about physical satisfaction. It was a means to an end. Nakamura, infatuated, expressed his desire for more of her company, for her to leave her husband. These words, meant as a declaration of love, were to Kyo a transactional offer. Her husband wasn't just an obstacle to romance. He was a financial drain, an invalid whose life was draining her resources. In 1952, Kyo came to a decision. She had a lover eager for her freedom, and a husband whose life insurance represented substantial financial gain. The logic was simple and merciless. She acquired potassium cyanide, a poison both powerful and hard to detect. She gave it to her husband, Hidenosuke, ending his long, slow decline with swift, harsh finality. To outsiders, it seemed the sad but expected passing of a chronically ill man. No one questioned it. No one suspected the quiet, hard-working wife. Kyo Kobayashi had committed her first murder, and she'd gotten away with it. But her husband's death didn't bring the life she'd imagined with her lover. The relationship with Nakamura fizzled out. The dream of starting fresh together evaporated in the starkness of reality. But Kyo had the insurance money, and she had a newfound cold confidence in her own ability to shape her destiny, to remove any obstacle in her path. The seed of bitterness sown in her youth had now yielded its first poisonous harvest. For several years, Kyo continued her life as a businesswoman, a respectable widow, but the hunger for wealth, the desire to escape the shadow of her impoverished past, gnawed at her. She constantly sought the next opportunity, the next big gain that would finally grant her the comfortable life she so desperately wanted. In the fall of 1958, that opportunity appeared in the form of a struggling hotel. The Hotel Nanka was small, located in Utsunomiya Prefecture, a place decaying from poor management. Its owner, 53-year-old Kamasuke Kata, was a man at his wits' end. He desperately needed money to keep the inn from collapsing. He'd heard about Kyo Kobayashi, the shrewd businesswoman from Kumagaya, and saw her as a potential savior. He reached out not for a buyout, but for a loan. He asked if she'd be willing to lend his 49-year-old wife, Yumi, 500,000 yen. Kyo's interest was piqued. She saw not a failing business to save, but an undervalued property to acquire. When she met with Yumi Akata, she came not as a lender, but as a predator. She negotiated aggressively, trying to drive the price down to 300,000 yen, seeking to exploit their desperation for her own gain. Yumi, a dignified woman despite her circumstances, refused. She wouldn't sell her family's dream for pennies. The refusal enraged Kyo's volatile ego. Her mind, already accustomed to viewing murder as a solution to her problems, began to scheme. If she couldn't buy the hotel at a bargain price, she'd take it by force. The Akatas changed from potential business partners to mere obstacles in this new plan. But this time, help would be needed. She was no longer young enough for such work alone. The physical deed itself, plus disposing of evidence, required someone younger, stronger. This led her to find Mitsuyoshi Onuki, a 36-year-old man lured by greed mixed with lust. Kyo expertly manipulated him with promises, 20,000 yen plus sexual favors in exchange for ending Yumi Akata's life. Onuki, weak-willed but driven by his urges, reluctantly agreed, becoming the instrument for executing Kyo's lethal intentions. The plan unfolded on February 8, 1960. While Yumi Akata slept soundly, unaware that financial troubles were the least of her concerns, Mitsuyoshi Onuki slipped inside carrying a linen cord. He wrapped it around her neck, pulling tightly until her breath ceased. The first phase was accomplished, but disposal remained an issue. Kyo, ever pragmatic, devised a solution. Onuki moved the body to the boiler room, dug into the compact soil, creating a makeshift grave, buried Yumi, covered her with dirt, then poured concrete over everything, sealing the crypt permanently. In the days that followed, questions about Yumi's sudden disappearance were met with prepared lies. According to their story, she'd fled, unable to handle the stress of the failing business. But in the tight-knit community, her absence left a void that was quickly filled with gossip and suspicion. There were whispers. There was speculation. The idea that she'd been murdered began to take root like a shadow spreading through the town's collective consciousness. With Yumi gone, Kyo essentially took her place at the hotel. She and Kamasuke, now a widower, ran it together. But Kamasuke had become a problem. The sole remaining owner, the last barrier preventing Kyo from claiming her prize. He was also someone who might start asking too many questions, who could grow suspicious of the stories circulating about his wife's disappearance. For Kyo, he had to be eliminated. In November, about 9 months after his wife's murder, Kyo contacted her accomplice again. She needed Onuki to kill Kamasuke. This time, she opted for poison, a method that had worked so successfully with her own husband years earlier. In mid-December, Onuki followed her instructions. He contaminated Kamasuke's food and sake with hydrochloric acid, but the attempt failed. The acid gave the food and drink a sharp, sour taste, and Kamasuke, put off by the odd flavor, refused to consume much of it. This setback forced them to reconsider their approach. A more direct method was needed. On New Year's Eve 1960, the three, Kyo, Onuki, and the unsuspecting Kamasuke, were together at the hotel watching television. It was an eerie picture of domestic normalcy. Two killers, and their intended victim spending a quiet evening. Kyo excused herself to prepare dinner, but when she returned, she didn't bring food. Instead, she crept up behind Kamasuke as he sat watching the screen and suddenly launched a violent attack, trying to strangle him. Onuki watched her struggle and rushed to help. He grabbed a knife and plunged it into Kamasuke's neck, the fatal blow that ended his life. The second owner of Hotel Nanko was dead. Once again, they concealed the body. When curious guests asked about Mr. Ikata, they were told another lie. He'd traveled to Tokyo to secure financing for the hotel. Kyo Kobayashi had finally achieved her goal. The hotel was hers, all obstacles removed. But the disappearance of two people in less than a year stretched credibility to its breaking point. The rumors that had been whispered were now loud and widespread. Local newspapers picked up the story, turning the strange case of the disappearing hotel owners into a subject of public fascination and police scrutiny. The net was tightening. On February 20th, 1961, just over a year after Yumi Ikata's murder, law enforcement arrived at Hotel Nanko. Kyo Kobayashi and Mitsuyoshi Onuki were arrested on suspicion of murder. In custody, separated from the hotel that had been the setting for her terrible deeds, Kyo's carefully constructed facade crumbled. Perhaps she recognized the futility of denial. Perhaps in some twisted way she wanted the world to understand the extent of her cunning. She confessed to her involvement in both Kamasuke Yumi Ikata's murders, but she went further still, delving into her past. She revealed a secret she'd kept for 9 years. She confessed to poisoning her husband Hidenosuke in 1952. And in one final desperate act of revenge or self-preservation, she accused her ex-lover, police officer Michiro Nakamura, claiming he'd been her accomplice in that first killing. The trial became a public spectacle. The story of the poisonous wife, the seemingly respectable widow who'd killed her way to a fresh start, both fascinated and horrified the nation. The court heard the gruesome details of her crimes, the cold-blooded poisoning of her husband, the deliberate seduction and recruitment of her accomplice, the brutal strangulations, the disrespect shown to the bodies, and the elaborate web of lies spun to cover evidence. Onuki was convicted alongside her as her instrument. Nakamura maintained his innocence throughout. Lacking evidence to support Kyo's allegations against him, he was acquitted, his reputation restored but forever tainted by his association with this infamous killer. On July 14th, 1966, the Supreme Court delivered its final judgment. There would be no mercy for Kyo Kobayashi or Mitsuyoshi Onuki. Both received death sentences. Kyo spent 4 more years awaiting execution at Tokyo Detention House. Now elderly, her existence narrowed to one small cell, an even tinier world than the impoverished farmhouse where her journey had begun. Her hunger for wealth and status, which had driven her to such heinous acts, had brought her to this final, disgraceful conclusion. On June 11th, 1970, 61-year-old Kyo Kobayashi was led from her cell to the execution chamber. Her accomplice, Onuki, faced the same fate that day. When the hangman's rope tightened around her neck, she became the first woman executed in Japan since World War II ended, a bleak and infamous distinction. The woman who'd fought her way up from poverty, using murder as a tool for social and economic advancement, had finally faced the ultimate consequence. Her story, a dark and twisted tale of greed and bitterness, became embedded in Japan's criminal lore. A cautionary tale that would inspire films and books. An unsettling testament to the evil that can hide behind the most unremarkable of facades. Story 13. Hammond, Indiana, lies right on the edge of Chicago's vast urban sprawl, a place marked by industry and smokestacks, by hardworking families and quiet tree-lined streets. It's a community defined by its proximity to the Great Lake and the big city, a place where life moves at a steady, modest pace. On Goslin Street, In a neighborhood of humble, well-kept homes, sat the small brick house that was the entire world for Dorothy and William Zinni. For over 5 decades, this home had been their sanctuary, a fortress of memories built slowly, year by year. By May 2006, Dorothy was 85 years old, and William was 91. Their days had slowed to a gentle, predictable rhythm, governed by the rising and setting of the sun, and the small, cherished routines of a lifelong share. William, once a robust steelworker, was now confined to a wheelchair. His world had shrunk to the familiar corners of their dwelling. Dorothy was his caretaker, his companion, his constant support. She had an indomitable spirit. Her 85 years had carved lines of laughter and determination into her face. But age hadn't diminished the fierce, passionate love she held for her family. Beyond her husband and the extended family that surrounded them, her greatest joy was her garden. The small patch of earth behind their house was her canvas. In spring and summer it exploded in a riot of colors, proof of her attentive, nurturing touch. It was a space full of life and growth, where she could feel the sun warming her back and the soil under her fingernails. It was her own haven within the sanctuary of her home. No one could have predicted that this peaceful spot would become the site of violence so vicious, so senseless, that it would leave a lasting wound on the community's soul and pose a question that would haunt a family for years to come. The evening of May 23, 26, began like any other in the Zinni household. The familiar smells of dinner cooking on the stove filled the small house, a comforting aroma of routine and care. Dorothy was in the kitchen preparing the evening meal for herself and the husband she'd looked after for so long. William sat in his wheelchair in another room, the television casting a flickering blue glow into the gathering dusk. It was a picture of domestic tranquility, an image of enduring love in life's final chapter. At some point that evening, an unusual sound from the backyard interrupted the quiet rhythm of the home. It was an odd noise, an intrusion into the familiar sounds of their life. For Dorothy, a woman fiercely protective of her home, any outside noise warranted investigation. Perhaps it was an animal in her beloved garden. Maybe it was a neighborhood kid taking a shortcut through the yard. She probably turned away from the stove, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'll be right back," she may have said to William, her tone carrying the casual confidence of someone who ruled her own small domain. She unlocked the back door and stepped out into the cool spring air, into the sanctuary of her garden. She didn't come back. Inside, William waited as minutes stretched into an unbearable eternity. The familiar, comforting smell of dinner began to change. It turned acrid, harsh. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the kitchen, then another. The pot left on the stove, abandoned in the sudden rush to check on the noise, was starting to burn. The smoke thickened, filling the small house with a choking gray haze that stung the eyes and caught in the throat. For William, trapped in his wheelchair, a new kind of terror began to take hold. The house was filling with smoke, and his wife, his Dorothy, hadn't returned. He was helpless, confined to his chair in his own home. As the smoke detector began its shrill, urgent wail into the darkness, it was this alarm that saved him. A neighbor, hearing its sharp call, rushed over. They found the house thick with smoke, an elderly man in a wheelchair, crying out in confusion and panic, and a pot of food charred and burning on the stove. The immediate danger was averted, the pot removed from heat, windows thrown open to the night air. But one question hung in the smoky atmosphere. Where was Dorothy? The search was brief, its outcome terrible. There in the backyard, among the blooming flowers and tended soil of her garden, lay Dorothy Zinni. She'd been viciously attacked. The cause of death was later identified as blunt force trauma to the head, a massive skull fracture ending her life in a surge of inconceivable brutality. She'd been beaten to death in the one place on Earth she should have been safe. Hammond police arrived at a scene of profound tragedy. The savagery of the crime was shocking. An 85-year-old woman murdered in her own garden, the circumstances deeply puzzling. Nothing of value seemed to have been taken from the house. There were no signs of forced entry. Her 91-year-old wheelchair-bound husband had been left completely unharmed. Robbery clearly wasn't the motive. This wasn't a random crime. It was an eruption of pure, raw violence, a burst of rage directed at a vulnerable elderly woman. Who could do such a thing? And why? The neighborhood was devastated. Dorothy was a beloved fixture, a maternal presence not just to her family but to the entire community. She was the kind of person who kept an eye on the neighborhood children and always had a friendly greeting for those passing by. The idea that such a gentle life could end in such ferocity was hard to process. "We're struggling to make sense of this," her granddaughter, Angela Patterson, told the Chicago Tribune. "There isn't anyone who would wish this upon her." The family was thrown into grief and confusion. They remembered Dorothy as the vibrant, loving center of their world. They recalled the Sunday dinners, the holiday gatherings, the ordinary, everyday moments of a life lived with kindness and grace. Now all that remained were those memories and the terrible image of her final moments. They were left to face a grief made worse by its pointlessness. As Hammond detectives investigated the case, they hit dead ends. There were no witnesses to the attack, no physical evidence pointing to a perpetrator. The murder weapon was never found. The crime seemed to have been committed by a ghost, a phantom that emerged from darkness to commit a terrible deed before vanishing completely. But when investigators broadened their search beyond their quiet town, a disturbing and frightening possibility began to emerge. Dorothy Zinni's murder wasn't an isolated incident. It was the latest in a series of vicious, apparently random clubbing attacks that had plagued the greater Chicago area over the previous year. A pattern was becoming clear, a design of violence so distinctive and so cruel that it suggested the terrifying possibility of a serial killer, a hammer-wielding assassin preying on the most vulnerable members of the community. This wave of horror had begun nearly a year earlier, in June 2005. Peter D'Agostino, a 48-year-old college instructor, a slight, scholarly man, was walking home from work in broad daylight when someone in a vehicle pulled up beside him. Without a word, the man got out, attacked D'Agostino with a sledgehammer, and drove off, leaving him to die on the sidewalk. The incident was witnessed, and a sketch of the attacker was created, but he remained unidentified. For months, there was silence. Then in the spring of 2006, the violence resumed with alarming frequency. On April 3rd, Anna Mae Davis, a 59-year-old woman, was found beaten to death in her Chicago home. 3 weeks later, on April 26th, a 14-year-old girl on her way to school was attacked from behind by a man wielding a hammer. Miraculously, she survived, and her description of her attacker bore an eerie resemblance to the composite sketch from D'Agostino's murder. The very next day, on April 27th, 74-year-old Evelyn Blaine was found murdered in her home, fewer than 5 blocks from where Anna Mae Davis had been killed. She too had been bludgeoned to death. And then, less than a month later, Dorothy Zinni was killed in her garden in Hammond. The method was identical. The victim profile matched. People who were elderly, small, or otherwise physically vulnerable. People unable to defend themselves. The lack of an obvious motive was consistent across all cases. The geographic pattern held. A concentrated cluster of attacks within Chicago and its nearby cross-border suburb. For authorities, it presented an alarming puzzle. Were these incidents connected? The similarities were too stark to ignore. Yet publicly, police departments were reluctant to link the crimes, perhaps out of fear of causing widespread panic. They were facing a predator who seemed to strike randomly, a phantom moving through urban spaces armed with a hammer and consumed by rage, selecting targets based on their perceived weakness. This connection, however tentative, cast Dorothy's murder in an even more frightening light. She hadn't fallen victim to a disturbed burglar. It seemed she was another casualty of a serial killer, a woman whose only mistake was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, seen as easy prey by someone stalking those who couldn't protect themselves. But even with this broader perspective, the investigation into Dorothy's murder hit obstacles. Leads dried up. If it was one person responsible for these hammer killings, they seemed to have vanished as suddenly as they'd appeared. The series stopped. Media attention faded. Life went on for most, but not for the Zini family. They faced only an emptiness where their family's pillar once stood, alongside persistent unanswered questions about who took her away and why. Years passed. William Zini spent his remaining time missing his beloved Dorothy, enduring constant pain from losing her so violently. The backyard garden on Gusland Street grew wild, its colors fading, a mute, poignant memorial to the woman who'd once tended it with such devotion. Dorothy Zini's case became just another file in the unsolved stack, a story of unresolved violence. But the expected tips never came. The crucial detail that would have cracked the case never emerged. The killer remained a phantom, his name, his motives, his history all swallowed by the silence of passing years. Dorothy Zini's murder is a story without an ending. It stands as testimony to the harsh reality that sometimes justice doesn't come. Sometimes the guilty escape capture. Sometimes the reason behind an event remains forever unknown. It's a story that highlights how fragile peace can be, how violence can erupt where least expected, shattering the quiet lives of innocent people. It tells of a beloved grandmother, a nurturer, a gardener who stepped into her garden one spring evening and met evil. Her killer didn't just end her life. He robbed a family of their sense of safety, their faith in a just and predictable world. In its place, he left a lasting void of grief, a wound that the passage of years can't fully heal. Now, over 15 years later, the case remains open. Dorothy Zini hasn't been forgotten. Her name lingers quietly in the records of unsolved crimes, a photograph on a cold case website, a memory cherished by family who still hope for answers that may never come. And in a quiet neighborhood in Hammond, Indiana, a modest brick house stands as a silent monument to a life lived with love and a death marked by unspeakable and unresolved violence.